Mama? Papa? Please don't leave me here. 7-year-old Elin watched her parents' backs disappear into the falling snow, their footsteps already vanishing beneath the white silence. They never looked back. Not once. In the dead of winter, in the heart of the Wyoming wilderness, they had walked her deep into the forest and left her there to die. Because she ate too much. Because times were hard. Because she was a burden they could no longer carry. As darkness crept between the frozen pines and the cold began stealing the feeling from her fingers, one truth became terrifyingly clear. No one was coming back for her. If this story touches your heart, I invite you to stay until the very end. Please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and comment your city below. I want to see just how far this little girl's journey can reach across the world. The morning had started with silence. That should have been Elin's first warning. In the cramped one-room cabin where she had lived all 7 years of her life, mornings were never silent. There was always the scrape of her father's boots against the rough-hewn floor, the clatter of her mother stirring whatever meager breakfast they could manage, the low murmur of adult conversation that Elin had learned to tune out because it was rarely about anything good. But this morning, nothing. She had woken to find her parents already dressed, already watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Her mother's face was pale and tight, her lips pressed into a thin line that Elin had come to associate with bad news. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes at all. "Get up," her mother said. "Put on your warmest clothes." "Where are we going?" No answer. Elin had learned not to ask twice. Questions only earned sharp words, or worse, the back of her father's hand. So she pulled on her threadbare dress, layered it with the wool sweater her grandmother had knitted before she died, and wrapped herself in the thin coat that had belonged to some other child before it found its way to her. The coat was too big, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, but it was all she had. Her mother handed her a small bundle, a piece of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, an apple that had seen better days. "For the walk," her mother said, and something in her voice made Elin's stomach clench with a fear she couldn't name. They walked for hours. The snow had been falling since before dawn, soft and steady, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and otherworldly. Elin trudged along behind her parents, her short legs struggling to keep pace with their longer strides. The cold seeped through her boots that were really just leather scraps held together with hope and stubbornness, and numbed her toes one by one. She ate the bread as they walked, too hungry to save it. The cheese she tucked into her pocket for later. The apple she clutched in her mittened hand, saving it because apples were rare and precious, and she wanted to make it last. "Papa," she called out once when her legs began to ache and her lungs burned from the cold air. "Papa, how much farther?" He didn't turn around. "Not much." But not much stretched into more hours, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink that might have been beautiful if Elin hadn't been so tired, so cold, so confused. They were deep in the forest now, deeper than Elin had ever been. The trees here were ancient giants, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks so thick that 3 men holding hands couldn't have circled them. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional distant cry of a bird. Then her parents stopped. Her father turned, and for the first time all day, he looked at her. Really looked at her. His face was weathered by years of hard labor and harder luck, his eyes the color of winter sky, pale and distant and cold. "Stay here," he said. Elin blinked. "Here? Your mother and we need to go. Find something. You wait here." She looked around at the endless white, the towering trees, the growing shadows. "But Papa, you wait here." His voice was sharp now, cutting. "Don't wander off. We'll be back." Her mother was already walking away, her shoulders hunched, her head bowed. She hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't even looked back. Elin watched her father follow, his footsteps quick and purposeful, carrying him away from her with each passing second. A strange panic began to flutter in her chest, like a bird trapped against a window. "Papa," she called. "Mama, wait!" They didn't stop. "Mama!" The word echoed through the trees, bouncing off trunks and branches until it faded into nothing. Elin started to run after them. her small legs churning through the snow, but they were moving too fast, and the snow was too deep, and within minutes they had vanished around a bend in the trees, and she couldn't see them anymore. She kept running anyway, following their footprints in the snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed white clouds in the frigid air. But the footprints led nowhere, or rather, they led to a rocky outcropping where the wind had swept the snow clean, and beyond that, she couldn't tell which way they had gone. "Papa! Mama!" Nothing. She called until her throat was raw, until her voice cracked and broke, until the words came out as nothing more than hoarse whispers. She stumbled through the snow, searching for any sign of them, any hint of which direction they had taken. There was nothing, just trees and snow and silence. The sun sank lower and the temperature dropped with it. The golden light faded to gray, and the gray deepened toward black. Elin's tears had frozen on her cheeks, leaving trails of ice that stung in the cold. They weren't coming back. The realization hit her slowly, then all at once, like water seeping through a crack until the whole dam gave way. They weren't looking for anything. They weren't going to find her. They had brought her here, to this place where no one would hear her scream, and they had left her to die. She thought of the food her mother had packed, barely enough for a single meal. She thought of the way her father had avoided her eyes all day. She thought of the conversation she had overhead in recent weeks, fragments of words that hadn't made sense until now. Can't afford to feed another mouth. Winter's going to be hard. Something has to give. She was the something. She had always been the something. Elin sank down against the trunk of an ancient oak, her back pressed against the rough bark, her knees pulled tight to her chest. The cold was a living thing now, wrapping around her like a predator, patient and certain of its prey. Her fingers had stopped hurting, which she knew was bad. She had heard stories of frostbite, of fingers and toes turning black and falling off. She was going to die here. The thought was strangely calm, almost peaceful. Maybe dying wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would be like falling asleep, and when she woke up, she would be somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere people wanted her. But even as the thought crossed her mind, something inside her rebelled against it. A spark of something stubborn and fierce, buried deep beneath the fear and the cold and the crushing weight of abandonment. She didn't want to die. She wanted to live. She wanted to grow up and have a real home and a family that wanted her, that chose her, that wouldn't throw her away like garbage when times got hard. She wanted to prove that she was worth something, that she wasn't just a burden, just a mouth to feed, just a problem to be solved by leaving her in the snow. But wanting wasn't enough. The cold was relentless, and she was so small, and the night was coming, and she was all alone. Elin closed her eyes and prayed to anyone who might be listening, not for rescue, because she had stopped believing in rescue the moment she watched her parents walk away. She prayed for courage. She prayed for strength. She prayed that if she had to die, she could die brave, the way the heroes in stories always died. The darkness was complete now, and the cold had sunk its teeth into her bones. 3 miles to the east, in a cabin that was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, Rowan Hale was having another argument with his empty cupboards. The cupboards were winning. He stood in the dim light of a single tallow candle, staring at shelves that held nothing but dust and memories. There had been flour once, and salt, and a tin of coffee that had lasted him through the worst of his grief. Now there was only emptiness, mocking him with its silence. 3 years ago, those cupboards had been full. 3 years ago, this cabin had been filled with warmth and laughter, and the smell of Sarah's cooking, rabbit stew on Sundays, fresh bread on Wednesdays, the apple pie she made every autumn from the wild apples that grew in the meadow behind their home. 3 years ago, he had been happy. Now Sarah was buried beneath the old oak tree on the hill, next to the tiny grave of the son who had never taken his first breath. 2 graves, 2 wooden crosses, 2 pieces of Rowan's heart that would never beat again. He had thought about joining them more times than he cared to admit. The loaded rifle above the door, the rope in the barn, the frozen creek that would welcome him if he just walked in far enough. He knew all the ways a man could end his suffering, had contemplated each one in the long, dark hours of countless sleepless nights. But something always stopped him. Some stubborn, foolish part of him that wasn't ready to give up, even when giving up seemed like the only sensible option. Sarah wouldn't have wanted him to give up. She had loved his stubbornness, had teased him about it in that gentle way of hers. "Rowan Hale, you're the most mule-headed man I've ever met, and I love you for it." He could still hear her voice sometimes, in the creaking of the cabin walls, in the wind that whistled through the gaps in the chinking. He knew it was just his imagination, just the desperate longing of a broken heart, but he held on to those phantom whispers anyway, because they were all he had left of her. The candle flickered, and Rowan turned away from the empty cupboards with a sigh. His traps. He needed to check his traps. He had set them 3 days ago along the creek bed, hoping for rabbit or beaver. Anything that would fill his belly and maybe provide a pelt he could trade for supplies. He should have checked them yesterday, but yesterday had been one of the bad days, the days when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, when the weight of grief pressed down so hard he could barely breathe. He had spent most of yesterday staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows move across the rough-hewn beams, wondering if today would be the day he finally gave up. It wasn't. It never was. He pulled on his coat, a good coat, sturdy and warm, the one thing of value he hadn't sold or traded, and wrapped a scarf around his neck. His boots were old but well made, and they still kept out most of the cold. He grabbed his lantern, lit it from the candle, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and making his eyes water. It was a clear night, the clouds having moved on, and the stars glittered overhead like scattered diamonds on black velvet. A half-moon provided enough light to see by, reflecting off the snow and creating an eerie silver glow that transformed the familiar forest into something strange and dreamlike. Rowan made his way along the path he had worn through countless trips, his boots crunching through the crusty top layer of snow. The forest was quiet, the way it always was on nights this cold. Even the owls and the wolves seemed to be huddled somewhere warm, waiting for the bitter temperatures to pass. He had checked 2 traps, both empty, and was making his way toward the third when he heard it. A sound, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. Rowan stopped, holding his breath, straining his ears against the silence. The sound came again, a voice, high and thin and desperate. "Mama, please." His heart stuttered in his chest. A child. There was a child out here, in this killing cold, in the dead of night. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. He knew what finding a child would mean. More responsibility, more mouths to feed, more complications in a life that was already complicated enough. He could barely take care of himself. How could he possibly take care of a child? But then the voice came again, weaker this time, and something inside Rowan that he had thought long dead roared to life with sudden, fierce urgency. He ran. His boots pounded against the snow as he followed the sound, his lantern swinging wildly and casting dancing shadows through the trees. He called out as he ran, his voice rough with disuse and desperation. "Hello, can you hear me? Where are you?" A sob answered him, barely audible, leading him toward a massive old oak that he recognized. It was a landmark, one of the oldest trees in the forest, its trunk as wide as a wagon wheel, and its branches reaching toward the heavens like gnarled fingers. And there, huddled at its base like a small frozen bird, was a child. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, a tiny thing wrapped in clothes that were woefully inadequate for the weather. Her hair was blonde, tangled with ice crystals, and her face, what he could see of it, was pale as the snow around her, her lips tinged with blue. "Oh God," Rowan breathed, and he was on his knees beside her before he consciously decided to move. Child, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, blue eyes, he saw, the color of summer sky, so incongruous in this winter wasteland. She looked at him without recognition, without fear, without much of anything at all. Her gaze was glassy, distant, the look of someone who had already half departed from this world. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." Rowan's hands shook as he touched her cheek. Ice cold, colder than any living person should be. He had seen frostbite before, had watched men lose fingers and toes and ears to the merciless Wyoming winters. This child was on the edge of something worse. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough. "I've got you, child. You're going to be all right." He didn't know if it was a lie or a promise. He only knew that he was going to do everything in his power to make it true. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, too light, far too light for a child her age. When had she last eaten? When had anyone cared enough to feed her? "Where are your parents?" he asked as he began walking toward his cabin, his pace as fast as he dared with the precious, fragile burden in his arms. "Gone," she whispered, and the word held a universe of pain. "Gone where?" "They left me." Her voice cracked, broke, shattered like thin ice. "They walked away and didn't come back." Rowan's jaw tightened. He knew there were hard times in the territory, knew that families were struggling, that some were making desperate choices just to survive. But to leave a child in the wilderness, in the dead of winter, to abandon your own flesh and blood to die alone in the cold. "What's your name, child?" "Elin. Elin." He said it softly, carefully, like something precious. "I'm Rowan, and I'm going to take you somewhere warm, somewhere safe. Can you stay awake for me, Elin? Can you keep your eyes open?" She nodded weakly against his shoulder, her small hand clutching his shirt with surprising strength. "That's good. That's real good. You just hold on to me, all right? Don't you let go." The walk back to his cabin had never felt so long. Every step was an eternity, every gust of wind a personal attack. He held Elin close, trying to share what warmth he had, talking to her constantly to keep her conscious, telling her about his cabin, about his traps, about Sarah's garden that he still tended even though nothing grew there anymore. He told her about the stars, pointing out the constellations that Sarah had taught him, the stories behind them that she had learned from her grandmother. He told her about those wolves he sometimes heard at night, and the deer that came to drink at the creek in the early morning, and the family of foxes that had made their den beneath his woodpile last spring. He talked and talked, his voice growing hoarse, because if he stopped talking, he might start thinking, and if he started thinking, he might realize just how impossible this situation was. Finally, his cabin came into view, a squat, dark shape against the snow, smoke still trickling from the chimney where he had banked the fire before leaving. It wasn't much, but right now it looked like salvation. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside, moving immediately toward the fireplace. The embers were still glowing, and he fed them carefully with kindling, then larger pieces of wood, coaxing the flames back to life. Within minutes, the fire was roaring, casting dancing shadows on the walls and pushing back the cold that had followed them inside. He laid Elin on the worn rug before the fireplace, close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close that she would burn. Then he knelt beside her and began the slow, careful work of warming her up. He rubbed her hands and feet, wincing at how cold they were, how stiff. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, which wasn't many, just two, both threadbare, both inadequate. He heated water over the fire and soaked rags in it, placing them against her neck, her armpits, her stomach, trying to warm her core first, the way his father had taught him long ago. As he worked, he studied her face. She was thin, painfully thin, the kind of thin that spoke of ongoing hunger rather than recent deprivation. There were hollows in her cheeks that shouldn't exist on a child so young, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of restless nights and heavy worries. But despite the thinness, despite the exhaustion, there was something in her face that caught his attention. A stubborn set to her jaw, a determined furrow in her brow even in unconsciousness. This was a child who had fought to survive, who had refused to simply give up and let the cold take her. She was a fighter. "Come on, Elin," he murmured, replacing a cooling rag with a fresh, warm one. "Don't you give up now? You didn't come this far to give up." Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't quite hear. He leaned closer. "What was that?" "Apple," she whispered. "I still have, my apple." Despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the crushing weight of responsibility that had just fallen on his shoulders, Rowan felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt the urge to laugh. "Your apple?" he asked, his voice gentle. Her hand moved weakly, reaching toward her pocket. "Mama gave it to me, for the walk. I was saving it." Rowan reached into her pocket and pulled out a small apple, bruised and half frozen but still intact. She had been abandoned in the wilderness to die, had spent hours in killing cold, had come within a hair's breadth of freezing to death, and she had held on to this apple through all of it. "You kept it safe," he said softly. It's the last thing she gave me. The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. He understood, suddenly and completely, what this apple represented. Not just food, not just a final gift from a mother who had abandoned her, but hope. The hope that maybe, somehow, her mother had loved her after all. The hope that keeping this one small thing would make everything make sense. He set the apple gently on the table beside them, where she could see it. "We'll save it," he promised, "until you're ready to eat it, or until you decide what you want to do with it. But right now, you need something warm in your belly." He had nothing to offer, nothing but the meager supplies he had been saving for his own survival. But as he looked at this child, this small, brave, broken child who had been thrown away like garbage by the people who should have protected her, he knew that his own survival no longer mattered as much as hers. He found the last of his dried venison, a handful of strips he had been rationing for days, and crumbled it into a pot of water heating over the fire. He added the last of his wild onions, a few dried herbs that Sarah had gathered years ago and he had never thrown away, and a precious pinch of salt. The result was thin and barely deserving of the name soup, but it was warm and nourishing, and that was what mattered. He lifted Elin's head gently and fed her the soup one small spoonful at a time, watching as color slowly returned to her cheeks and life flickered back into her eyes. She ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear at any moment. When the bowl was empty, she looked up at him with those summer sky eyes, and her voice, when she spoke, was barely more than a whisper. "Why? Why what? Why did you help me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Rowan thought about all the ways he could answer, because it was the right thing to do, because he couldn't leave a child to die, because some part of him was still human despite everything he had lost. But what came out was simpler and perhaps more honest. "Because you needed help," he said, "and I was there." Her eyes filled with tears, the first real tears he had seen from her, not the frozen tracks on her cheeks when he found her, but warm, living tears that spilled down her face and dripped onto the blankets. "My mama and papa didn't want me," she said, her voice breaking. "They said I ate too much. They said times were hard and something had to give." She swallowed hard, her small hands clutching the blanket. "I tried to eat less. I tried so hard, but it wasn't enough. I was never enough." Rowan felt something crack inside his chest, the same place that had shattered when Sarah died, the same place he had sealed off with walls of grief and solitude. But this child's words, this child's pain, were finding their way through those walls, seeping into the cracks and demanding entry. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What your parents did, that wasn't your fault. That was their failure, not yours. You hear me? You did nothing wrong. But they left me. They were wrong." He said it firmly, with a conviction he didn't know he still possessed. "They were wrong to leave you, and they were wrong to make you feel like you weren't worth keeping. Every child is worth keeping, every single one." She stared at him, her eyes wide and searching, looking for the lie that must be hiding behind his words. But there was no lie. There was only truth, a truth that Rowan was discovering even as he spoke it. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," he continued. "I don't know how we're going to manage, or what we're going to eat, or how any of this is going to work out. But I know this much. You're not going back out into that cold. Not tonight. Not ever. You understand me?" Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Good." He pulled the blankets tighter around her, tucking them under her chin the way Sarah used to do for him when he came in from a long day in the cold. "Now you sleep. I'll keep the fire going. And tomorrow, we'll figure things out together." Her eyes were already closing, exhaustion finally claiming her now that she was warm and fed and safe. But before she drifted off, she reached out one small hand and grabbed his sleeve. "Rowan? Yeah? Thank you." 2 words. 2 simple words that shouldn't have meant anything, shouldn't have pierced through 3 years of grief and isolation and self-imposed exile from the world of the living. But they did. Rowan sat beside the fire all night, watching this child sleep, listening to her breathe, wondering what in the world he had just gotten himself into. He had no food, barely any supplies, no way to provide for a child. He was a broken man living on the edge of poverty and despair, surviving on stubbornness and not much else. The sensible thing would be to take her to town tomorrow, hand her over to someone who could actually take care of her, and go back to his slow spiral toward oblivion. But as he watched the firelight play across her pale face, as he counted each breath and thanked whatever powers might be listening for each one, he knew he wasn't going to do the sensible thing. He was going to keep her. He didn't know how. He didn't know why, or rather, he knew why but couldn't put it into words. There was something about this child, something that resonated with the broken pieces inside him, something that made him feel, for the first time in 3 years, like he might have a reason to keep going. She had been thrown away, and he knew what it was like to feel thrown away, abandoned by life, left behind by everyone he loved. Maybe two broken people could find a way to be whole together, or maybe they would just fail together, and at least neither of them would be alone. Either way, Rowan thought, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the cabin window, it was better than what they had before. Outside, the wind had died down and the snow had stopped falling. The forest was quiet, peaceful, as if the terrible events of the previous night had never happened. In a few hours, Elin would wake, and they would have to face the reality of their situation. The empty cupboards, the uncertain future, the 100 impossible obstacles that stood between them and anything resembling a stable life. But that was for later. For now, there was warmth, there was shelter, there was a child who had been saved, and a man who had found, in the act of saving her, something worth living for. For now, that was enough. What? Elin woke slowly, consciousness returning in fragments. The crackle of a fire, the smell of wood smoke, the rough weave of wool blankets against her cheek. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there, and panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. Then she saw him. The man from last night, Rowan, she remembered, was sitting in a chair by the window, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. He wasn't asleep. She could tell by the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair. He was just resting, waiting for her. She studied him in the thin morning light. He was tall. She remembered that from when he had carried her through the snow, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could break a man in half, but had touched her with nothing but gentleness. His face was weathered, lined with years and hardship, and there was gray at his temples that seemed premature for a man who couldn't have been more than 35. But it was his eyes that she remembered most clearly. Dark eyes, deep and sad, like windows into a room where the sun never shone. Eyes that had seen too much, lost too much, carried too much weight for too long. Eyes like hers. As if sensing her gaze, he opened his own eyes and turned to look at her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two strangers bound together by circumstance and desperation and something that neither of them could name. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was rough with fatigue. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. "How do you feel?" She took inventory. Her fingers and toes tingled, the feeling returning after the numbness of the cold, and her whole body ached as if she had been beaten, but there was no sharp pain, no sign of serious injury. "Better," she said. Then, remembering her manners, "Thank you." He nodded, accepting her thanks with the same economy of words he seemed to apply to everything. Then he stood, his joints cracking as he unfolded himself from the chair and moved toward the fireplace. "I'm going to make something to eat," he said over his shoulder. "It won't be much, but it'll be warm. Then we need to talk." Elin felt her stomach clench. "Talk about what?" He paused, his back to her, and she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. "About what happens next." What happened next was a bowl of watery porridge, made from the last of Rowan's oats, scraped from the bottom of a nearly empty barrel, and a conversation that would change both their lives forever. They sat at his small table, the morning light streaming through the cabin's single window, and Rowan asked her questions in his quiet, careful way. Where did she come from? How long had she been in the forest? Did she have any other family, anyone who might be looking for her? Elin answered as best she could, her voice faltering sometimes but growing stronger as she went. She told him about the farm where she had lived, a full day's walk to the west, a failing farm, she understood now, though she hadn't had the words for it before. She told him about her parents, about the fight she had overheard, about the growing silence that had filled their home in recent weeks. She told him about the walk and the forest, and the moment she had realized they weren't coming back. By the time she finished, her porridge was cold and untouched, and Rowan's face was set in hard lines that made him look older than his years. "You're sure there's no one else?" he asked. "No aunts, uncles, grandparents?" "My grandmother died last winter. She was the last one. Mama used to say—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "Mama used to say that we were on our own, and that's why we had to be careful. That's why I had to eat less and work more and not be a burden." The word burden came out bitter, ugly, and Elin saw something flash in Rowan's eyes. Anger, she thought, though not directed at her. "You were never a burden," he said, echoing his words from the night before. "What they did to you, that's on them, not you. You understand?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure she did understand. She had been told she was a burden for so long by so many people that the belief had sunk into her bones and become part of who she was. "Here's the thing, Elin." Rowan leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea. "I'm not exactly in a position to take care of a child. Look around you. I've got nothing. Empty cupboards, barely enough wood to last the week, and no prospects for anything better." She looked, and she saw. The cabin was small and sparse, its furnishings rough-hewn and utilitarian. The only decorations were a faded sampler on the wall, "Home Sweet Home" embroidered in uneven stitches, and a photograph on the mantel of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Is that your wife?" she asked, surprising herself. Rowan's face went still. "Was," he said after a long moment. "She died 3 years ago. I'm sorry." "So am I." He set down his cup and fixed her with that steady, dark gaze. "Point is, I'm a mess. I've been living out here alone because I couldn't face being around people anymore, and I've let everything go to hell because I didn't see the point in trying. You deserve better than what I can offer you." Elin felt her heart sink. She knew what was coming. He was going to send her away, just like everyone else. He was going to take her to town and hand her off to strangers who would look at her with pity and whisper about the poor abandoned child while deciding who would be stuck with her. "But," Rowan continued, and she looked up sharply, "I'm not going to send you away unless you want to go. I've got no right to make that choice for you. So I'm asking, what do you want, Elin? If you want to go to town, I'll take you. I'll make sure you end up somewhere safe. But if you want to stay—" He paused, his jaw working. "If you want to stay, I'll do everything in my power to give you a decent life. I don't know if I can promise you much, but I can promise you this. I will never leave you in the forest to die." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elin thought about the town, about the strangers who lived there, about the uncertain future that waited for her among people who didn't know her and didn't care about her. She thought about the looks she would get, the whispers she would hear, the endless cycle of being passed from home to home because no one really wanted her. Then she thought about this man, this stranger who had found her in the snow and carried her to safety. This man who had given her his last food, his warmest blankets, who had sat up all night watching over her. This man who looked at her not with pity or obligation, but with something that looked almost like recognition, as if he saw in her a reflection of himself. "I want to stay," she said, and her voice was stronger than it had been in months. "If you'll have me." Something shifted in Rowan's face, a loosening of tension, a softening of the hard lines around his eyes. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "All right then," he said, "you'll stay." And just like that, everything changed. The first weeks were the hardest. Rowan was true to his word. He didn't have much to offer. The cupboards were bare, the winter was relentless, and every day was a struggle for survival. But somehow, against all odds, they managed. He taught her how to check the traps, how to read the signs of the forest, how to find rabbit trails and deer tracks in the snow. She was a quick learner, eager to prove herself useful, and her small hands were surprisingly deft at tasks that required delicacy and patience. He showed her how to cook what little they caught, how to stretch a single rabbit into 3 meals, how to make bone broth that filled the belly even when there was nothing else, how to find edible roots and bark when the hunting failed. In return, she brought something into his life that he hadn't known he was missing: purpose. It wasn't much, just having someone to talk to, someone to cook for, someone who needed him. But for a man who had spent 3 years wallowing in grief and isolation, it was everything. He found himself getting up earlier, working harder, caring about things he had long since stopped caring about. He repaired the holes in the roof that he had ignored for 2 winters. He chopped wood until his arms ached, building up a stockpile that would see them through the coldest months. He set more traps, hunted more carefully, pushed himself further than he had in years. All because there was a child depending on him. Elin, for her part, bloomed like a flower finding sunlight after a long darkness. The color returned to her cheeks. Her eyes lost some of their haunted emptiness. She smiled more, tentatively at first, then with increasing frequency, and laughed sometimes at the clumsy jokes Rowan told her, jokes so old and worn that they should have been embarrassing. She wasn't the burden her parents had made her believe she was. She was resilient, resourceful, and brave beyond her years. She never complained about the sparse meals or the cold nights or the hard work. She simply did what needed to be done, and did it well. And slowly, carefully, like two wounded animals learning to trust each other, they began to build something that neither of them had expected. A home. Not just a shelter from the cold, but a real home. A place of warmth and safety and belonging. A place where Elin didn't have to measure every bite of food or flinch at every raised voice. A place where Rowan could finally start to let go of the grief that had held him prisoner for 3 years. The cabin that had been a tomb became, gradually, something else entirely. Rowan took down the photograph of Sarah from the mantel, not to forget her, but to put her where she belonged, in his heart, not on display like a shrine to his own suffering. He told Elin about her, about the woman she had been and the life they had shared, and somehow speaking her name out loud made the pain more bearable instead of worse. Elin, in turn, told him about the grandmother she had loved and lost, the one person before Rowan who had ever made her feel wanted. They traded stories of the dead like precious gifts, honoring those they had lost while making room for those they had found. It wasn't easy. There were bad days, days when Rowan's grief hit him like a wave and he couldn't drag himself out of bed, days when Elin woke screaming from nightmares about the forest and the cold and her mother's back as she walked away. There were arguments and misunderstandings and moments when they both wondered if this strange arrangement could possibly work. But they pushed through, they held on, and day by day they proved that sometimes the families we choose are stronger than the ones we're born into. Winter's grip slowly began to loosen. The days grew longer, the nights less brutal. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth that held the promise of spring, and in a small cabin on the edge of the wilderness, a broken man and an abandoned child looked out at the changing world and saw something they had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The apple sat on the windowsill, untouched. Elin looked at it every day, that small, bruised, half-frozen apple that her mother had given her as a final, inadequate goodbye. Some days she thought about eating it, about finally letting go of the last thing that connected her to the parents who had thrown her away. Other days she thought about throwing it out, watching it rot in the snow like her memories of the family she had once had. But she never did either. She just let it sit there, a reminder of where she had come from and who she had been. One evening, as Rowan was preparing their dinner, rabbit stew, a luxury they could finally afford now that his traps were producing again, Elin picked up the apple and turned it over in her hands. "What should I do with it?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. Rowan glanced over his shoulder, saw what she was holding, and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know." She traced the bruises on the apple's skin with one finger. "It feels wrong to eat it, but it feels wrong to throw it away too." Rowan wiped his hands on a rag and came to sit beside her. "You know what I think? I think that apple isn't really about your mother anymore. It's about you, about who you were and who you're becoming." She looked at him, confused. The girl who held on to that apple through everything, through the cold and the fear and the near death, she was holding on to hope. She was refusing to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. "That's who you are, Elin. That's the girl I found in the snow." His words settled into her heart, filling spaces she hadn't known were empty. "So maybe," he continued, "instead of eating it or throwing it away, you could plant it. Come spring, we can put it in the ground and see if it grows. And then you'll have something that started with your mother but became something new, something that belongs to this life, not the old one. Elin stared at the apple, seeing it with new eyes. You think it would grow? Maybe, maybe not. But either way, you'll have done something with it instead of just letting it sit there, reminding you of pain. She thought about that for a long moment. Then, carefully, she set the apple back on the windowsill. I'll wait for spring, she said, and then I'll plant it. Rowan nodded, and something that might have been pride flickered across his weathered face. Good girl, he said softly. That's my good girl. And for the first time, Elin didn't flinch at the word my. For the first time, it felt like something she could belong to without losing herself. For the first time, it felt like home. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself was hesitant to believe that winter had finally loosened its grip. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy earth that squelched underfoot. The creek behind Rowan's cabin swelled with runoff, its icy waters rushing and tumbling over rocks that had been locked in ice for months. And in the windowsill of the small cabin, the apple sat waiting, just as Elin had promised. She had been with Rowan for nearly 3 months now, and in that time, something remarkable had happened to both of them. The cabin that had once been a monument to grief and isolation had transformed into something warmer, something alive. There were small touches everywhere, a bundle of dried wildflowers that Elin had gathered from beneath the melting snow, a patchwork curtain she had sewn from scraps of fabric Rowan had found in Sarah's old trunk, drawings scratched onto pieces of bark that decorated the walls with childish but earnest depictions of rabbits and deer, and a tall man holding hands with a small girl. Rowan noticed these changes the way a man notices the sun after a long illness. With wonder, with gratitude, with a faint disbelief that such brightness could exist in a world that had seemed so dark for so long. You're staring again, Elin said without looking up from her task. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully sorting through a pile of seeds that Rowan had traded for at the general store in town. His first trip to civilization in over a year, undertaken specifically because Elin had asked if they could grow a garden. Was I? Rowan leaned against the doorframe, watching her small fingers separate the seeds into neat piles. Sorry, just thinking. About what? He considered lying, considered deflecting the way he always used to when Sarah asked him questions he didn't want to answer. But Elin had a way of seeing through his deflections, of waiting patiently until he told her the truth. About how different things are, he said finally. How different I am. Elin looked up at that, her blue eyes curious. Different how? 3 months ago, He paused, searching for words that wouldn't frighten her. I was in a bad place. I'd given up on pretty much everything, and then you showed up, and suddenly I had a reason to keep going. She was quiet for a moment, processing his words with the seriousness she applied to everything. I was in a bad place too, she said softly. I thought nobody wanted me. I thought I was going to die alone in the snow, and nobody would even notice I was gone. She looked down at the seeds in her hands. But then you found me, and you didn't leave me there. I couldn't have left you there, not if I'd wanted to. Why not? It was a question she had asked before, in different ways, as if she still couldn't quite believe that someone had chosen to save her when everyone else had chosen to throw her away. Rowan understood the need to ask, understood it in his bones, because he had asked the same question of himself 1,000 times. Why had he saved her? Why had he taken on the burden of another mouth to feed when he could barely feed himself? Why had he opened his heart to this child when opening his heart meant risking more pain, more loss, more grief? Because, he said slowly, carefully, when I found you in the snow, I saw myself. I saw someone who had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love them, someone who had been left to die alone. And I thought if I could save you, maybe I could save myself too. Elin's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She had learned in her short, hard life to hold her tears inside where no one could see them. Did it work? She asked. Did saving me save you? Rowan crossed the room and knelt beside her, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. Yeah, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Yeah, I think it did. The planting of the apple happened on a morning in late April, when the ground had finally thawed enough to dig and the air carried the first hints of true warmth. Elin had been saving the apple all winter, watching it slowly shrivel and brown on the windowsill, and now she carried it outside like a sacred relic, cupped carefully in both hands. Rowan had already prepared a spot for it, a small patch of earth near the cabin where the sun hit strongest in the afternoons. He handed Elin a trowel, and together they dug a hole in the dark, rich soil. "You sure about this?" he asked, not because he doubted her decision, but because he wanted her to be certain. Elin nodded. "I'm sure. I don't want to eat it, and I don't want to throw it away. I want to make something new from it, something that's mine." "Then let's do it." She placed the apple in the hole, her small fingers pressing it gently into the earth. Then together, they covered it with soil, patting it down firmly, but not too hard. "There," Rowan said. "Now we wait and see what grows." Elin sat back on her heels, staring at the small mound of earth. What if nothing grows? Then we'll have tried, and trying is what matters. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Besides, I have a feeling about this apple. I think it's going to surprise us." She leaned into him, her head resting against his side. "Thank you, Rowan." "For what?" "For everything. For finding me. For keeping me. For—" She struggled for words. "For making me feel like I'm worth something." Rowan's throat tightened. He had never been good with words, had never known how to express the things that lived in his heart. But for Elin, he tried. "You are worth something," he said. "You're worth everything. And don't you ever let anyone tell you different." They sat there together as the sun climbed higher, watching over the patch of earth that held their hopes for the future. Two broken souls slowly mending, slowly learning that they didn't have to be broken forever. But even as the spring brought new life and new hope, shadows were gathering on the horizon. Shadows that neither of them could see coming. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks later in the form of a man on a mule. Rowan was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard the approach. The slow clop of hooves, the creak of leather, the jingle of a bridle. He set down his axe and moved around to the front of the cabin, his hand instinctively moving toward the hunting knife at his belt. The man on the mule was thin and weathered, with a face like old leather and eyes that had seen too much of the world. He wore the clothes of a traveling peddler, dusty coat, battered hat, boots that had walked 1,000 miles. And he carried saddlebags bulging with wares. "Morning," the man said, tipping his hat. "Morning." Rowan kept his voice neutral, his stance wary. He hadn't had a visitor in over a year, and he wasn't sure he wanted one now. "Name's Ezra Cobb. I'm a peddler by trade, traveling through these parts selling goods and buying furs." The man's eyes swept over the cabin, taking in its modest condition. "Noticed smoke from your chimney. Thought I'd stop by, see if you needed anything." "We're fine." "We?" Ezra's eyebrows rose. "Last I heard, Rowan Hale was living out here alone. Turned into a hermit after his wife passed, they said. Didn't want nothing to do with nobody." Rowan's jaw tightened. He had forgotten how fast gossip traveled in these parts, how quickly news spread from homestead to homestead like wildfire. "Things change," he said shortly. "They do indeed." Ezra leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes sharp and curious. "Folks in town are talking, saying you've got a child out here with you, a little girl." "What of it?" Nothing. Just curious is all. Where'd she come from?" Rowan felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. "That's none of your business." "Easy there, friend. I'm not looking to cause trouble." Ezra held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Just making conversation. It's a long ride between homesteads, and a man gets lonely." The cabin door opened, and Elin stepped out onto the porch. She was holding a broom. She had taken to sweeping the cabin every morning, a habit she said her grandmother had taught her, and her eyes were wide and wary as she took in the stranger. "Rowan, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine." He forced his voice to stay calm, to not betray the unease coiling in his gut. "Just a peddler passing through. He's leaving now." Ezra's eyes had fixed on Elin, studying her with an intensity that made Rowan's skin crawl. "Well now," the peddler said softly, "she's a pretty little thing, isn't she? Blonde hair, blue eyes. About 7 years old, I'd guess. She's my daughter. The lie came easily, protectively. And you need to leave. Your daughter? Ezra smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Funny. I don't remember hearing about Rowan Hale having a daughter, just a wife who died and a baby that never took its first breath. Rowan moved forward, putting himself between Ezra and the cabin, between the peddler's prying eyes and the child he had sworn to protect. I said leave. Now. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, Rowan with his hand on his knife, Ezra with that cold, calculating smile. Then the peddler shrugged and gathered his reins. All right, I'm going. No need for unpleasantness. He turned his mule back toward the trail, but paused to look over his shoulder. I'll be passing through town on my way south. Might mention what I saw out here. Folks are curious, you know. A man living alone with a child that isn't his. That's the kind of thing that gets people talking. He rode away without another word, leaving Rowan standing in the yard with his heart pounding and his mind racing. Rowan? Ellen's voice was small, frightened. Who was that man? What did he mean? Rowan turned to face her, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen when he first found her in the snow, the fear of being unwanted, abandoned, thrown away. It's nothing, he said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. Just a nosy peddler, nothing to worry about. But even as he said the words, he knew they were a lie. Something had shifted. Something had changed. The outside world, which had seemed so distant and irrelevant, had suddenly come knocking at his door. And he had a terrible feeling that it wasn't going to stop knocking until it got what it wanted. The weeks that followed were tense, filled with an undercurrent of anxiety that neither Rowan nor Elin could quite shake. They went about their daily routines, checking traps, tending the garden, preparing for the summer ahead, but there was a wariness to their movements now, a constant looking over the shoulder that hadn't been there before. Rowan found himself watching the trail more often, listening for the sound of approaching hooves or the distant voices of strangers. He started keeping his rifle loaded and within reach, something he hadn't done since the early days after Sarah's death. And at night, when Elin was asleep and the cabin was quiet, he would sit by the window and stare out into the darkness, wondering what was coming and whether he would be able to protect her from it. Elin, for her part, seemed to sense his unease. She became quieter, more watchful, her blue eyes following Rowan's every movement, as if afraid he might disappear if she looked away. She stopped asking questions about the peddler, but sometimes Rowan would catch her staring at the trail with a look of profound dread on her small face. It was during one of these quiet, anxious evenings that Rowan finally decided he needed to tell her the truth, or at least as much of it as he understood himself. Elin, he said, setting down the piece of leather he had been mending. Come sit with me. We need to talk. She came immediately, settling onto the floor beside his chair with her knees drawn up to her chest. Her eyes were wary, guarded, braced for bad news. That peddler who came by a few weeks ago, Rowan began. He's probably told people about you by now. People in town, people who might start asking questions. Questions about what? About who you are, where you came from, why you're living with me. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The thing is, Elin, what your parents did to you, leaving you in the forest like that, it's not something most folks would understand. And even if they did understand, there are some who might think it's not right for you to be living here with me. Her face went pale. Why not? Because I'm not your father, not by blood anyway. And there are people who think that blood is all that matters, that family is only family if you're related. But that's not true. Her voice was fierce, almost angry. You're more my family than they ever were. You saved me. You kept me. You... She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. I know, Rowan said softly. I know. But not everyone sees it that way. And if people start asking questions, if they start poking around and making trouble, they'll take me away. It wasn't a question. They'll take me away and put me somewhere else, with strangers who don't know me, who don't want me. The fear in her voice cut Rowan to the bone. This was her greatest terror, he knew, greater even than the memory of the forest and the cold, the fear of being unwanted, the fear of being abandoned again. Listen to me. He reached out and took her hands in his his grip firm and steady. I'm not going to let that happen. You hear me? I made you a promise the night I found you. I said I would never leave you, and I meant it. Whatever comes, whatever happens, I'm going to fight for you, for us. But what if you can't? What if they're stronger than you? Then I'll fight harder. I'll fight until I can't fight anymore. And even then, I won't stop. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. Finding none, she launched herself into his arms, burying her face against his chest. I don't want to leave, she whispered. This is my home. You're my home. Rowan held her tight, his hand cradling the back of her head, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. You're not going anywhere, he said. I promise. But even as he made the promise, he knew that keeping it might be the hardest thing he had ever done. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, in the middle of June, when the garden was coming up strong and the apple tree they had planted had sprouted 3 small, hopeful leaves. Rowan heard them coming from a mile away, the sound of multiple horses, the murmur of voices, the unmistakable authority of men who believed they had the right to go wherever they pleased. He was in the garden with Elin, showing her how to thin the carrot seedlings when the sound reached his ears. Inside, he said quietly. Now. Elin didn't argue, didn't ask questions. She simply rose and walked calmly toward the cabin, her small back straight and her head high. Rowan felt a surge of pride at her composure. This child who had been through so much, who had every reason to fall apart, was holding herself together with a strength that belied her years. He waited in the yard as the riders approached. 3 men on horseback, their faces grim and official. Rowan recognized 2 of them, Sheriff Nathaniel Briggs, a barrel-chested man with a reputation for fairness but little tolerance for troublemakers, and Deputy Wilson, a younger man with nervous eyes and a tendency to follow orders without question. The 3rd man was a stranger, dressed in the somber clothes of a bureaucrat, carrying a leather satchel that bulged with papers. Rowan Hale, Sheriff Briggs said, reining in his horse. Afternoon. Sheriff, Rowan kept his voice neutral. What brings you all the way out here? Official business, I'm afraid. The sheriff dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. This here is Mr. Cornelius Finch from the Territorial Welfare Office in Cheyenne. He's got some questions about the child living here with you. Rowan's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression calm. What kind of questions? Mr. Finch stepped forward, his thin face pinched with self-importance. Questions about the child's origins, Mr. Hale, about her legal status, about the propriety of her current arrangements. Her arrangements are just fine. That remains to be determined. Finch pulled a sheaf of papers from his satchel. We've received reports that you are harboring a minor child with no legal claim of guardianship. A child who, by all accounts, is not your biological offspring and has no documented connection to you whatsoever. She's my daughter. She is not your daughter. Finch's voice was sharp, cutting. She is a child of unknown parentage, abandoned in the wilderness and taken in by a man with no legal right to her custody. Under territorial law, such a child must be placed in the care of proper authorities until her situation can be assessed and appropriate arrangements made. The words hit Rowan like physical blows. He had known this might happen, had prepared himself for the possibility, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the cold, bureaucratic language that reduced Elin to a child of unknown parentage, a problem to be solved, made his blood run cold. Appropriate arrangements, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. And what would those be? The child will be taken to the territorial orphanage in Laramie, where she will be properly cared for until a suitable placement can be found. An orphanage, Rowan laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to take a child who was abandoned by her own parents, who nearly died alone in the snow, and put her in an orphanage? That's your idea of appropriate arrangements? Mr. Hale, I understand this is difficult. You don't understand anything. Rowan stepped forward, and both the sheriff and his deputy tensed. That girl in there? She's not a problem to be solved. She's not a case file in your satchel. She's a child, a living, breathing child who has been through more in her 7 years than most people endure in a lifetime. And she has finally found a place where she feels safe, where she feels wanted. And you want to tear that away from her? For what? For propriety? Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat. Rowan, I know this isn't easy, but the law is the law. If you've got no legal claim to the girl, legal claim be damned. I've cared for her, fed her, kept her alive through the hardest winter in 10 years. I've watched her grow from a terrified, half-frozen waif into a strong, brave young girl. I've given her a home when her own parents threw her away like garbage. If that doesn't give me a claim to her, then your law isn't worth the paper it's written on. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The three men exchanged glances, and for a moment Rowan hoped that his words had gotten through to them. Then Mr. Finch spoke again, and his voice was ice. Nevertheless, Mr. Hale, the law must be followed. We are here to take the child into protective custody. You may contest this action through the proper legal channels, but for now, she must come with us. Over my dead body. Mr. Hale, I said over my dead body. Rowan's hand moved to the knife at his belt, not threateningly, but with a clear message. You're not taking her. Not today. Not ever. Sheriff Briggs sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. Rowan, don't do this. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Then leave. Go back to town and tell whoever sent you that you couldn't find her. Tell them I'd already moved on. Tell them whatever you want. But you're not taking that girl. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, his eyes meeting Rowan's with something that might have been sympathy. Then he shook his head. I can't do that, Rowan. I've got a job to do. And as much as I might sympathize with your situation, I can't just ignore a directive from the Territorial Welfare Office. He paused, his voice softening. But I'll tell you what. I'll give you a week. 1 week to get your affairs in order, to figure out how you want to handle this. After that, we'll be back. And next time we won't be asking. It was a compromise, a small one, but a compromise nonetheless. Rowan knew he should take it, knew that fighting now would only make things worse. But the thought of having only a week, of the clock already ticking toward the moment when they would come to take Elin away, made him want to scream. 1 week, he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. 1 week. Sheriff Briggs mounted his horse, and his deputy and Mr. Finch followed suit. Use it wisely, Rowan. I've got no quarrel with you, but I'll do my job if I have to. They rode away without another word, leaving Rowan standing alone in the yard, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He stood there for a long time after they had gone, staring at the trail they had taken, his mind racing with plans and fears and desperate hopes. The sun was beginning to set by the time he finally turned and walked back toward the cabin. Elin was waiting for him inside, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale but composed, and Rowan realized with a start that she had heard everything, had been listening at the window the whole time. They want to take me away, she said. It wasn't a question. They want to try. Are you going to let them? Rowan crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her small hands in his. No, he said, his voice firm with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. I'm not going to let them. I promised you I would fight, and I meant it. But I need you to trust me, Elin. Can you do that? She looked at him for a long moment, those summer sky eyes searching his face for any sign of weakness, any hint that he might fail her the way everyone else had. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. I trust you, she said. I've always trusted you. Good. He squeezed her hands gently. Because we've got a lot of work to do, and not much time to do it. That night, after Elin had fallen asleep, Rowan sat at the table with a single candle burning low and tried to think. A week. He had a week to figure out how to keep Elin, how to convince the authorities that she belonged with him, that he had every right to be her father even if the law didn't recognize it. He could run. The thought crossed his mind more than once. Pack up what little they had, head north into the mountains, disappear into the wilderness where no one would ever find them. He knew these lands better than anyone. He could keep them hidden for years if he had to. But he dismissed the idea almost as soon as it formed. Running would only prove what they already believed, that he was an unfit guardian, that Elin was better off without him. And what kind of life would that be for her? Always looking over her shoulder, always afraid of being caught, never able to put down roots or make friends or live a normal life? No. Running wasn't the answer. He needed to fight. But to fight, he needed allies, people who could vouch for him, who could testify to his character and his fitness as a guardian. People who could stand before the law and say that Rowan Hale was a good man, that Elin was lucky to have him. The problem was, Rowan didn't have any allies. He had spent the last 3 years pushing everyone away, isolating himself from the community that had once welcomed him. He had no friends, no family, no one who would speak on his behalf, except his mind went to Sarah and to the life they had built together before everything fell apart. They had been part of a community once, neighbors who brought food when someone was sick, friends who helped with the harvest and the barn raising and the 100 small tasks that made up frontier life. Sarah had been the one who maintained those connections, who remembered birthdays and sent condolences and kept track of who needed what. When she died, those connections had withered and died with her. But maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely dead. Maybe there were still people out there who remembered the Rowan Hale he used to be, the man who had worked his land with pride, who had helped his neighbors when they needed it, who had loved his wife with a devotion that was the envy of the county. Maybe those people would help him now, if he asked. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope he had. The next morning, Rowan woke before dawn and began preparing for a trip to town. "I have to go," he told Elin as she rubbed sleep from her eyes. "There are people I need to talk to, things I need to arrange. I'll be gone most of the day, maybe longer." Fear flickered across her face. "Can I come with you?" "Not this time." He saw her expression crumble and quickly added, "It's not that I don't want you with me, but some of these conversations, they're going to be difficult, and I don't want you to have to hear them." "What kind of conversations?" Rowan hesitated. He had never lied to Elin, not about anything important, and he wasn't going to start now. "I'm going to ask for help," he said. "From people I haven't talked to in a long time, people who might not want to help me. But I have to try, because you're worth fighting for." Elin was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. "Be careful," she said. "I will. And come back." The words hit him harder than he expected. Come back. Such a simple request, but coming from a child who had watched her parents walk away and never return, it carried the weight of the world. "I'll always come back," he said. "Always, no matter what." He rode out an hour later, leaving Elin with strict instructions to stay inside, to keep the doors locked, to not open them for anyone. She had promised, her face solemn and serious, and he had to trust that she would keep her word. The ride to town took the better part of 3 hours, giving Rowan plenty of time to rehearse what he was going to say and plenty of time to doubt whether any of it would work. By the time the first buildings came into view, his stomach was in knots and his palms were slick with sweat. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of a single main street lined with wooden buildings in various states of repair. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other establishments that served the needs of the scattered homesteaders and ranchers who made up the local population. Rowan hadn't been here in over a year, and as he rode down the main street, he felt the weight of curious eyes on him. Some of the faces were familiar, people he had known before Sarah's death, before his self-imposed exile. Others were strangers, newcomers who had arrived during his long absence. He ignored them all, focusing on his destination, the small white building at the end of the street with a hand-painted sign that read, "Reverend William Harker, Pastor." Reverend Harker had officiated at Rowan's wedding to Sarah. He had presided over her funeral and over the small, heartbreaking service for the son they had lost. He was the closest thing Rowan had to a friend in this town, though they hadn't spoken since the day Sarah was buried. Rowan dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, then stood for a long moment outside the church, gathering his courage. Finally, with a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The church was small and simple, with wooden pews worn smooth by years of use and a plain wooden cross on the wall behind the pulpit. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting patterns of light and shadow on the floor. Reverend Harker was at the front of the church, arranging hymnals on a table. He looked up at the sound of the door, and his eyes widened in surprise. "Rowan Hale." The Reverend's voice was warm but cautious. "It's been a long time." "It has. I heard you were still alive out there, but to be honest, I wasn't sure whether to believe it." Harker set down the hymnals and walked toward Rowan, his eyes taking in the changes 3 years of solitude had wrought. "You look Different. I feel different. And there's a child now, I hear. A little girl. Word traveled fast, apparently. Rowan nodded. Her name is Elin, and she's why I'm here. Reverend Harker listened in silence as Rowan told him everything, finding Elin in the snow, taking her in, watching her bloom from a terrified waif into a brave young girl. The peddler's visit, the sheriff's warning, the threat of the territorial welfare office coming to take her away. When Rowan finished, Harker was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. That's quite a story, Rowan. Quite a responsibility you've taken on. I know. And you're here because you need help, someone to speak on your behalf. Yes. Harker turned away, walking toward the window and staring out at the dusty street. His back was to Rowan, his shoulders tense. You know, when Sarah died, I tried to reach out to you, multiple times. I came to your cabin, wrote you letters, asked mutual friends to check on you, and you pushed me away, every single time. Guilt twisted in Rowan's gut. I know, I wasn't in a place where I could accept help. I wasn't in a place where I could accept anything. And now? Now things are different. Elin made them different. Harker turned back to face him, and there was something searching in his eyes. Why do you want to keep her, Rowan? Really? Is it because you love her, or is it because you need someone to fill the hole that Sarah left? The question hit Rowan like a punch to the gut. Not because it was cruel, but because it was fair. He had asked himself the same question, late at night when doubt crept in and whispered that he wasn't fit to be anyone's father. Maybe it started that way, he admitted. Maybe when I first took her in, part of me was just looking for something to fill the emptiness. But it's not like that anymore. Elin isn't a replacement for Sarah or for the child we lost. She's her own person, strong and brave and smart and kind, and I love her for who she is, not for who she might help me become. He took a step forward, his voice raw with emotion. She's my daughter, Reverend, maybe not by blood, but by everything that matters. I would die for her. I would kill for her. And I am begging you, to help me keep her. Harker was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, a small smile crossed his weathered face. That's what I needed to hear, he said. That's what I needed to know. He walked to Rowan and clasped his shoulder firmly. I'll help you, Rowan. I'll speak on your behalf to anyone who will listen. I'll write letters, I'll testify, I'll do whatever it takes. But you need to understand something. This won't be easy. The law doesn't care about love. It cares about paperwork and propriety, and what looks right on paper. You're fighting an uphill battle. I know. But you're going to fight it anyway. I don't have a choice. Harker nodded slowly. Then let's get to work. Rowan spent the rest of the day in town, moving from house to house, shop to shop, visiting everyone who had ever known him and Sarah. Some doors were closed in his face, others opened grudgingly, their occupants wary of the hermit who had shunned them for 3 years. But a few, more than he had expected, listened to his story and agreed to help. Old Mrs. Patterson, who had been Sarah's closest friend, wiped tears from her eyes and promised to write a letter to the welfare office testifying to Rowan's character. The Hendricks family, whose barn Rowan had helped build 10 years ago, offered to appear in person if a hearing was called. Even the gruff blacksmith, a man of few words and fewer smiles, clapped Rowan on the shoulder and said he would put in a good word. By the time Rowan mounted his horse for the ride home, he had gathered a small army of supporters, people willing to stand up for him, to vouch for his fitness as a guardian, to fight for his right to keep the child he loved. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was a start. The sun was setting by the time he reached the cabin, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. As he dismounted, the cabin door flew open and Elin came running out, her face alight with relief. "You came back," she cried, throwing herself into his arms. "I told you I would." "I know, but—" She buried her face against his chest. "I was so scared." Rowan held her tight, feeling her small body tremble against his. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Not ever." They stood there together as the last light faded from the sky, holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to a piece of driftwood. The week ahead loomed before them, dark and uncertain, full of dangers they couldn't predict and outcomes they couldn't control. But for this moment, at least, they were together. And together, they would face whatever came. That night, after Elin had fallen asleep, Rowan sat by the window and watched the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, in offices and courtrooms and government buildings, people were deciding his fate, deciding Elin's fate, based on laws and regulations that knew nothing of love, nothing of sacrifice, nothing of the bond that had formed between a broken man and an abandoned child. He thought about the week ahead, about the battle he would have to fight, about the possibility, the very real possibility, that he might lose. And then he thought about Elin, about the way she laughed when he told his terrible jokes, about the stubborn set of her jaw when she was determined to do something, about the way she looked at him with those summer sky eyes full of trust and hope and love. He wasn't going to lose her. He couldn't. Whatever it took, whatever he had to do, whatever sacrifices he had to make, he would find a way to keep her. Because she wasn't just a child he had saved from the snow. She was his daughter, his family, his reason for living, and no law in the world was going to take that away from him. The moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light through the window and illuminating the small form sleeping peacefully on the bed. Rowan watched her breathe, watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, watched the small smile that played at the corners of her lips as she dreamed whatever dreams 7-year-olds dream. Tomorrow, the fight would begin in earnest. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, there was home. And for now, that was enough. The fever came without warning, stealing into the cabin like a thief in the night, and wrapping its burning fingers around Elin's small body. Rowan woke to the sound of her whimpering, a soft, pitiful sound that cut through his sleep and brought him bolt upright in his chair by the window. He had fallen asleep there again, keeping watch over the darkness as if his vigilance alone could hold back the forces gathering against them. 3 days had passed since the sheriff's visit, 3 days of preparation and planning and desperate hope, and the strain was beginning to tell. But all thoughts of sheriffs and welfare officers vanished the moment he crossed to Elin's bed and touched her forehead. She was burning. "Elin." He shook her gently, then more firmly when she didn't respond. "Elin, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy and unfocused, seeing something beyond the walls of the cabin, beyond the reach of his voice. "Mama?" she whispered. "Mama, I'm sorry. I tried to eat less. I tried. Elin, it's me. It's Rowan." But she didn't seem to hear him. Her head tossed on the pillow, her small hands clutching at the blankets, her lips moving in a constant stream of half-heard words and pleas. The fever had taken her somewhere else, somewhere Rowan couldn't follow. He worked through the night, drawing on everything he knew about sickness and healing, knowledge he had learned from Sarah, who had nursed him through influenza 2 winters before she died, and from his own mother, who had raised 6 children to adulthood in a time when half of all babies never saw their first birthday. He stripped off Elin's sweat-soaked nightgown and replaced it with a fresh one from Sarah's old trunk. He soaked rags in cool water from the creek and laid them on her forehead, her neck, her wrists, anywhere he could think of to bring down the terrible heat that seemed to radiate from her skin. He coaxed water between her cracked lips, a few drops at a time, terrified that she would choke, terrified that she would refuse, terrified of 1,000 things he couldn't name. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity of fear and helplessness. Rowan had faced death before, had watched Sarah slip away from him despite everything the doctor could do, had held the still form of his newborn son in trembling hands. But this was different. This was a child who had already survived so much, who had clawed her way back from the brink of death once before, who deserved a chance at life that the world seemed determined to deny her. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't. But as the night wore on and the fever refused to break, Rowan began to understand that wanting wasn't always enough. Dawn came, gray and cold, and Elin was no better. If anything, she was worse. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that made Rowan's stomach clench with dread, and she had stopped responding to his voice entirely, lost in a world of fever dreams and buried memories. He knew he needed help, real help, a doctor, medicine, something beyond the folk remedies and desperate prayers that were all he had to offer. But the nearest doctor was in town, 3 hours away, and leaving Elin alone in this state was unthinkable. For a long moment, Rowan stood paralyzed by indecision, his mind racing through options and discarding them one by one. Then, with a curse and a prayer, he made his choice. He would ride to town. He would find the doctor and bring him back, no matter what it cost, no matter what he had to promise or threaten or beg. And he would do it as fast as humanly possible. He wrapped Elin in every blanket he owned, tucked hot stones from the fire around her to keep her warm, and left a pitcher of water within easy reach in case she woke. Then he pressed a kiss to her burning forehead and whispered words he wasn't sure she could hear. "I'll be back. I promise. Just hold on, Elin. Hold on for me." The ride to town was the longest 3 hours of Rowan's life. He pushed his horse harder than he had ever pushed it before, ignoring the animal's labored breathing and flecked foam, ignoring the ache in his own muscles and the burning in his lungs. The world blurred around him, trees and rocks and stretches of open ground passing in a meaningless rush. And all he could think about was Elin, alone in the cabin, fighting for her life. What if she died while he was gone? What if he came back to find her cold and still, her summer sky eyes closed forever? The thought was unbearable, a blade twisting in his gut, and he pushed it away with savage determination. She wasn't going to die. He wouldn't let her. He reached town in just over 2 hours, his horse staggering with exhaustion as he pulled up in front of the doctor's office. He was off the animal's back before it had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard, his hand already reaching for the door. It was locked. "No," Rowan breathed. "No, no. No, no." He pounded on the door with his fist, the sound echoing through the quiet morning street. "Doctor! Dr. Barnes! Open up!" No answer. He pounded harder, his desperation mounting with each passing second. "Please, I need help. There's a sick child." "He ain't there." Rowan spun around. An old man was sitting on a bench outside the general store, watching him with mild curiosity. "What do you mean he's not there?" "Rode out to the Henderson place yesterday. Their youngest took sick. Probably won't be back till tomorrow. Maybe the day after." Tomorrow. The word hit Rowan like a physical blow. Tomorrow might as well be a lifetime away. "Is there anyone else? Anyone who knows medicine?" The old man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, there's old Mrs. Chen. She's got some Chinese remedies she learned from her grandmother. Folks say she's helped people the regular doctors gave up on." "Where does she live?" "Little house on the edge of town, past the livery stable. Yellow door, can't miss it." Rowan was already moving before the old man finished speaking. He left his exhausted horse tied to the hitching post and ran, through the streets of town, past startled shopkeepers and curious townspeople, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. The house with the yellow door was small and neat, surrounded by a garden that seemed to contain every plant known to man and a few that Rowan had never seen before. He knocked on the door, then knocked again, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman who answered was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes bright and sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She was tiny, barely reaching Rowan's chest, but there was a presence about her, a quiet authority that made him feel like a small boy standing before a stern schoolteacher. "You're the one with the sick child," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you—" "I hear things. News travels fast in small towns." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. Tell me everything." Rowan told her about Elin, about the fever, about his desperate ride to town. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she rose and moved to a cabinet filled with bottles and jars and bundles of dried herbs. "How long has the fever been this high?" "Since last night. Maybe before. I don't know when it started." "And the child? She was exposed to cold? To hardship?" "Yes." Rowan's voice cracked. "Last winter. She nearly froze to death before I found her." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "The body remembers trauma. Sometimes it stores it away, hidden, and then something triggers it. Stress, fear, exhaustion, and it all comes flooding back." She selected several bottles and began measuring out powders and liquids with practiced precision. This child has been through much. Her body is fighting old battles and new ones at the same time. Can you help her? Mrs. Chen paused in her work and looked at him, really looked at him with those sharp, ancient eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. I can try, she said, but you should know, this is not just a sickness of the body. It is a sickness of the spirit. She is fighting demons that no medicine can touch. She needs more than herbs and remedies. She needs a reason to live. She has one. Rowan's voice was fierce. She has me. Then make sure she knows it, Mrs. Chen handed him a small bag filled with packets and bottles, along with careful instructions for their use. Go back to her. Give her these medicines. And talk to her. Even if she cannot hear you, talk to her. Let her know she is not alone. That is the most powerful medicine of all. Rowan took the bag with trembling hands. How much do I owe you? Mrs. Chen waved a dismissive hand. Pay me when the child is well. If she is not well, she shrugged. Then you will owe me nothing. He wanted to thank her, wanted to find words that could express the depth of his gratitude, but his throat was too tight and his eyes were burning, and all he could do was nod and turn and run back the way he had come. The ride home was even faster than the ride to town, though Rowan wasn't sure how that was possible. His horse was nearly dead on its feet, and so was he, but neither of them stopped or slowed until the cabin came into view. Rowan was off the horse before it had fully stopped, bursting through the cabin door with his heart in his throat, terrified of what he might find. Elin was exactly where he had left her, wrapped in blankets, her small face flushed and damp with fever sweat. But she was breathing, still fighting. He collapsed beside her bed, his legs finally giving out, and pressed his forehead against the edge of the mattress. I'm back, he whispered. I promised I would come back, and I did. Now you have to promise me something, Elin. You have to promise to keep fighting. Can you do that? Can you hold on just a little longer? No response, just the shallow rasp of her breathing and the distant call of a bird outside the window. Rowan got to work. He followed Mrs. Chen's instructions exactly, brewing teas and mixing poultices and administering medicines with the careful precision of a man whose whole world depended on getting every detail right. He kept the fire burning, kept the cool cloths on her forehead, kept talking to her even though she gave no sign of hearing. He told her about Sarah, about how they had met at a church social when he was 22 and she was 19, how he had tripped over his own feet trying to ask her to dance, how she had laughed at him but said yes anyway. He told her about the early days of their marriage, the struggles and the joys, the dreams they had built together on this patch of land. He told her about the day Sarah had learned she was pregnant, about the way her face had glowed with happiness, about the plans they had made for the nursery, and the names they had argued over late into the night. He told her about the terrible day when everything had gone wrong, when the baby had come too early and Sarah had bled too much, and the doctor's face had grown grim and hopeless. He told her about the darkness that had followed, the years of grief and isolation, the slow erosion of everything he had once been. He told her about the night he had found her in the snow, about the moment he had decided to save her, about how that decision had saved him too. You came into my life when I had given up on everything, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. You gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning, a reason to work and plan and hope. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could be something more than a broken man waiting to die. He took her small, hot hand in his and held it gently. I need you, Elin. I know that's a lot to put on a little girl, and I'm sorry, but it's the truth. You're not a burden. You never were. You're a gift, the best gift I've ever received, and I am begging you from the bottom of my heart to stay with me. Don't give up. Don't let go. Fight, Elin. Fight like I know you can. The hours passed. Day turned to night, and night turned to day again. Rowan lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of Elin's breathing and the endless cycle of medicines and cool cloths and whispered prayers. He didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't move from her side except when absolutely necessary. Somewhere in the middle of the second night, when his body was screaming for rest and his mind was fogged with exhaustion, Elin began to speak. Her words were fragmented, disconnected, pieces of memory rising to the surface of her fever dreams like debris from a shipwreck. She talked about her mother, her father, the farm where she had grown up. She talked about the walk through the forest, the cold, the terrible moment when she had realized she was alone. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said something that broke Rowan's heart. They left me because I wasn't good enough. I wasn't pretty enough, or smart enough, or quiet enough. I ate too much and cried too much and needed too much. I was too much, and so they left me. Rowan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. That's not true. They said so. They said I was a burden. They said something had to give, and I was the something. They were wrong. Rowan leaned closer, his voice fierce with conviction. They were wrong, Elin. What they did to you, it wasn't about you. It was about them, their weakness, their failure. You were just a child, an innocent child, and they made you pay for their own inadequacy. But if I had been better, no. He took her face in his hands gently, carefully, forcing her fever-glazed eyes to focus on his. No. There was nothing wrong with you, nothing. You were a child who deserved to be loved and protected, and they failed you. That failure is on them, not you. Do you understand? Her eyes were clearing now, the fever receding enough to let her see him, really see him. Rowan? I'm here. You came back. I told you I would. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the fever flush. I thought maybe I was dreaming you. Maybe you were never real. Maybe I died in the snow and all of this was just what happens when you die. Rowan's heart shattered and reformed in the space of a single breath. I'm real, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This is real. And you didn't die in the snow, Elin. You survived. You fought, and you survived, and you found me, and we found each other, and I am never, ever going to leave you. Promise? I promise. Cross your heart. He made the gesture solemnly, drawing an X over his chest. Cross my heart. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that belied her 7 years. They're going to try to take me away, she said. The men who came. They want to put me somewhere else. Rowan had hoped she had forgotten about that, had hoped the fever had burned away the memory of the sheriff's visit. But Elin remembered. Of course she remembered. She remembered everything. They're going to try, he admitted, but I'm not going to let them. What if you can't stop them? Then I'll keep fighting until I can. What if they're stronger than you? Then I'll get stronger. What if... Her voice broke. What if they take me and I never see you again? Rowan pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling her small body tremble against his chest. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and fierce. I don't care what they try to do. I don't care what laws they cite, or what papers they wave, or what threats they make. You are my daughter, maybe not by blood, but by everything that matters, and I will move heaven and earth to keep you with me. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. But I need you to do something for me, Elin. I need you to get better. I need you to fight this fever the way you fought everything else in your life, because I can't do this alone. I need you by my side, strong and healthy and ready to face whatever comes. Can you do that for me? She nodded slowly, her eyes still bright with tears but stronger now, more focused. I can do it. Good girl. He kissed her forehead. That's my brave girl. The fever broke that night, as suddenly as it had arrived. One moment Elin was burning with heat, the next she was drenched in sweat, her skin cool to the touch, her breathing deep and even. Rowan sat beside her, watching, hardly daring to believe, until at last he was certain. She was going to be all right. He wept then, silently, his shoulders shaking with relief and exhaustion and the accumulated terror of the past 2 days. He wept for Elin, for himself, for Sarah, and the child they had lost, for all the pain and fear and uncertainty that had marked his life since the day everything fell apart. But mixed with the grief was something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at the simple fact that this child, this fierce and brave and beautiful child, was still alive. Still with him. still fighting. When his tears finally subsided, Rowan wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked down at Elin. She was sleeping peacefully now, her color returning to normal, her lips curved in a faint smile. Whatever dreams she was having, they seemed to be good ones. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, "I love you, Elin. I should have said it sooner, but I was scared. Scared that if I loved you, I would lose you, the way I lost everyone else. But I'm not scared anymore. Or maybe I am, but it doesn't matter, because loving you is worth the risk. You're worth everything." She stirred in her sleep and her hand found his, her small fingers curling around his rough, calloused palm. "Love you too," she murmured, so softly he almost missed it. Rowan stayed awake the rest of the night, watching over her, his hand in hers, his heart fuller than it had been in years. The next few days were a slow return to normalcy, or as close to normal as their lives could be, given everything that hung over them. Elin recovered quickly once the fever broke, her young body resilient in ways that never ceased to amaze Rowan. Within 2 days, she was sitting up and eating. Within 3, she was walking around the cabin, weak but determined. Within a week, she was outside in the garden, tending to the vegetables and checking on the progress of her apple tree. The tree had grown remarkably since they had planted it. What had started as 3 small leaves had become a dozen, and the stem had thickened and straightened, reaching toward the sun with an eagerness that seemed almost human. Elin spent hours sitting beside it, talking to it, telling it stories about the world she hoped to see someday. Rowan watched her from the cabin doorway, his heart swelling with an emotion he could only call pride. "She's a fighter," said a voice behind him. He turned to find Mrs. Chen standing in the yard, her ancient face creased in what might have been a smile. He hadn't heard her approach, hadn't even known she was coming, but somehow her presence didn't surprise him. "Mrs. Chen, I wasn't expecting you. I came to check on my patient." She walked past him into the cabin, her sharp eyes taking in everything, the neatly made bed, the fire crackling in the hearth, the lingering smell of the medicines she had provided. "And to collect my fee now that she is well." Rowan reached for his coin purse. "How much do I owe you?" Mrs. Chen held up a hand. "I do not want your money." "Then what?" "I want you to come to town." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "Tomorrow. There is a hearing scheduled at the courthouse. The Territorial Welfare Office has called it to determine the fate of your daughter." Rowan's blood ran cold. "Tomorrow? But we were supposed to have a week." "The timeline has changed. Someone pushed for an earlier date." Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed. "Someone who does not want you to have time to prepare." "Finch." The name came out like a curse. "That bureaucrat from Cheyenne." "Perhaps. The reason does not matter. What matters is that you are there, ready to fight for your child." Rowan looked out the window at Elin, still sitting beside her apple tree, her blonde hair catching the afternoon sun. "I'll be there," he said. "We'll both be there." Mrs. Chen nodded, satisfied. "Good. And Rowan?" "Yes?" Do not underestimate the power of truth. These officials, they deal in papers and regulations and precedents. But underneath all that, they are human beings with hearts that can be moved. When you speak tomorrow, speak from your heart. Tell them your truth. It may not be enough, but it is the only weapon you have. She left as quietly as she had come, disappearing into the trees with a speed that seemed impossible for someone her age. Rowan stood in the doorway for a long time after she was gone, thinking about her words, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about the battle that lay ahead. He had fought for Elin before, fought the cold, fought the sickness, fought his own despair. But this was different. This was a battle he wasn't sure he knew how to win. That night, after Elin was asleep, Rowan sat at the table and tried to write down what he wanted to say at the hearing. He had never been good with words, had always been more comfortable with actions, with the silent language of hard work and quiet devotion. But he knew that words would be his only weapon tomorrow. The paper remained blank. Every time he tried to write something, it came out wrong, too formal, too desperate, too much like begging. He crumpled sheet after sheet and threw them into the fire, watching them curl and blacken and turn to ash. Finally, just before dawn, he gave up on writing and simply sat, staring at the wall, trying to find the words that would save his daughter's life. They wouldn't come. At some point, He must have fallen asleep, because the next thing he knew, there was a small hand on his shoulder and a small voice in his ear. "Rowan? Rowan, wake up. It's morning." He opened his eyes to find Elin standing beside him, dressed in the best clothes they had, a simple dress that had once belonged to Sarah, taken in and hemmed to fit her small frame, with her hair brushed and braided and her face pale but determined. "You knew," he said, "about the hearing. I heard Mrs. Chen talking to you yesterday." She sat down in the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I know what's going to happen today. Elin, I'm scared." Her voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear she had carried with her since the day her parents walked away. "I'm scared they're going to take me away and put me somewhere terrible. I'm scared I'll never see you again. I'm scared of everything." Rowan reached across the table and took her hands in his. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I don't know what's going to happen today. I don't know if anything I say will make a difference. But I know one thing for certain. I love you, and I will fight for you until my last breath." Elin's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I love you too," she said. "And I want you to know something, Rowan. No matter what happens today, no matter what they decide, you're still my father. Not the people who left me in the snow. You found me, you saved me, you chose me. And that makes you my father, no matter what any piece of paper says." The words hit Rowan like a wave, washing over him, filling him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, his voice rough. "I had a good teacher." He laughed then, a real laugh, the first one in days, and pulled her into his arms. "Come on," he said. "Let's go show those officials what family really means." The ride to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Elin sat in front of Rowan on the horse, her small body pressed against his chest, her hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity. She didn't speak, but every so often she would lean back against him, as if drawing strength from his presence. Rowan held her close and tried to ignore the dread coiling in his stomach. The town square was more crowded than Rowan had ever seen it. Word had spread about the hearing, and it seemed like every homesteader and rancher within 20 miles had come to witness the spectacle. Some faces were sympathetic, others curious, still others openly hostile. Rowan ignored them all, focusing on the courthouse at the end of the street, a squat wooden building that served as the center of what passed for law and order in this corner of Wyoming. They dismounted and made their way through the crowd, Elin's hand gripping Rowan's with fierce determination. People parted before them, some whispering, some calling out words of encouragement. Rowan didn't respond to any of them. His eyes were fixed on the courthouse door. Sheriff Briggs was waiting for them at the entrance. "Rowan." The sheriff's voice was neutral, professional. "The hearing is about to begin. They're waiting for you inside." "Who's they?" "Judge Morrison, Mr. Finch from the welfare office. A few others." Briggs paused and something flickered in his eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or regret. "Rowan, I want you to know, I did what I could. I told them about your character, about how you've cared for this girl, but Finch has been making noise about legal precedents and proper procedures, and the judge likes things done by the book. Thank you for trying. Just be careful in there. Don't lose your temper, no matter what Finch says. It'll only make things worse." Rowan nodded and stepped through the courthouse door, Elin's hand still clutched in his. The hearing room was small and stuffy, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. A wooden bench served as the judge's platform, behind which sat an elderly man with a face like weathered granite and eyes that revealed nothing. Mr. Finch sat at a table to the right, his papers spread before him, his expression one of barely concealed triumph. There were other people in the room, witnesses, Rowan realized, people who had been called to testify. He recognized some of them, Mrs. Patterson, who had promised to speak on his behalf, the Hendricks family, Reverend Harker. But there were others too, strangers with hard faces and harder eyes, and Rowan had a sinking feeling about who had called them. "Mr. Hale." Judge Morrison's voice was dry, dispassionate. "Please take your seat. This hearing will now come to order." Rowan led Elin to a chair near the front of the room and sat down beside her. His heart was pounding, his palms were sweating, but he kept his face calm, his posture straight. Whatever happened in this room, he would face it with dignity. We are here today to determine the custody of the minor child known as Elin, Judge Morrison continued. Mr. Finch, as the representative of the Territorial Welfare Office, you may proceed with your case. Finch rose, smoothing his coat with an air of self-satisfaction that made Rowan want to punch him. Thank you, Your Honor. The facts of this case are simple. A child of unknown parentage was discovered in the wilderness by Mr. Rowan Hale and has been living with him for the past several months without any legal documentation of guardianship. Under territorial law, objection. The word came from Reverend Harker, who had risen to his feet with fire in his eyes. This is not a trial, Reverend, Judge Morrison said mildly. There are no objections. Then let me rephrase. Mr. Finch's characterization of the facts is incomplete and misleading. The child was not simply discovered. She was rescued from certain death by Mr. Hale, who has since provided her with a loving home, adequate care, and the kind of stability she never received from her birth parents. Birth parents who, I might add, are not present to offer their side of the story, Finch interjected. Birth parents who abandoned their own child in the forest to die, Harker shot back. Birth parents who are, by any reasonable measure, unfit to have any say in her future. The room erupted in murmurs. Judge Morrison banged his gavel, calling for order. Enough, both of you sit down. He fixed his granite gaze on Finch. Mr. Finch, continue, but stick to the facts. Finch cleared his throat, clearly annoyed by the interruption. As I was saying, under territorial law, a child without legal guardianship must be placed in the care of the proper authorities until her situation can be resolved. Mr. Hale has no legal claim to this child, no documentation of adoption or guardianship, no, I have love. The words were spoken quietly, but they cut through Finch's monologue like a knife. Rowan had risen to his feet, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes locked on the judge. I have love, he repeated. I don't have papers or documentation or whatever else Mr. Finch thinks I need, but I have something that no piece of paper can give. I love that child. I would die for her. I would kill for her. I have fought for her every single day since I found her half frozen in the snow, and I will continue fighting for her until my last breath. The room had gone silent. Even Finch seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Mr. Hale, this court operates on laws and precedents, not emotions. Then your laws are wrong. Rowan's voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it. Your laws would take a child who has finally found safety and security and throw her into an orphanage where she'll be just another number, just another burden to be dealt with. Your laws would punish a child for the crime of being abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect her. Mr. Hale, I'm not finished. He took a step forward, his voice rising. You want to know about legal claims? Here's my claim. I saved her life. I fed her when she was starving. I warmed her when she was freezing. I sat by her bed for 2 days straight when she was burning with fever, and I fought with everything I had to bring her back. I have earned the right to be her father, Your Honor. I have earned it with sweat and tears and sleepless nights, and a love so deep it terrifies me. He turned to look at Elin, who was watching him with eyes full of wonder and hope, and something that looked very much like pride. That child is my daughter. Not because of blood, not because of papers, but because we chose each other. We saved each other. And if your laws can't recognize that, then your laws don't deserve to be followed. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, slowly, Elin rose from her chair and walked to stand beside Rowan. She took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his, and turned to face the judge. He's telling the truth, she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears streaming down her face. My birth parents left me in the forest to die because they didn't want me anymore. But Rowan found me. He saved me. He never once made me feel like I was a burden or a problem. He made me feel like I was worth something. She squeezed Rowan's hand tighter. He's my father, the only real father I've ever had. And I don't care what any of you say or what your laws say or what Mr. Finch says. I'm staying with him. And if you try to take me away, I'll run away and come right back. I'll keep coming back, again and again, because this is where I belong. This is my home." The words hung in the air, powerful and defiant and heartbreakingly young. Judge Morrison stared at them for a long moment, his granite face revealing nothing. Then, slowly, something shifted in his eyes. A softening, a recognition, a glimpse of the human being beneath the judicial exterior. He looked at Finch, then at Harker, then back at Rowan and Elin standing hand in hand before him. "This court will recess for 1 hour," he said. "When we reconvene, I will deliver my decision." He banged his gavel and swept out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence that slowly erupted into a chaos of whispers and speculation. Rowan didn't hear any of it. He was too busy holding Elin, feeling her small body tremble against his, wondering if their words had been enough, wondering if anything would ever be enough. The hour passed like a lifetime. Rowan and Elin sat together in a corner of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters who offered words of encouragement and promises of help. Mrs. Patterson brought them food that neither of them could eat. Reverend Harker led a quiet prayer. Even Sheriff Briggs stopped by to say that, whatever happened, he thought Rowan had spoken well. None of it helped. None of it could ease the terrible uncertainty of waiting. Finally, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and Judge Morrison emerged. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something different about him. A weight, perhaps, or a weariness, as if the decision he was about to render had cost him something. "All rise," called the bailiff. The room rose. Rowan gripped Elin's hand so tightly he feared he might break it. Judge Morrison took his seat and looked out over the assembled crowd. His gaze lingered on Rowan and Elin for a long moment before he spoke. "I have spent the past hour reviewing the law, the precedents, and the arguments presented by both sides. I have also spent that time thinking about what justice truly means. Not just the letter of the law, but its spirit." He paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "The law says that a child without legal guardianship must be placed in the care of the proper authorities. The law says that blood relationships take precedence over all others. The law says many things that are designed to protect children from harm and exploitation." Finch was smiling. Rowan felt his heart begin to sink. "But the law also recognizes," Morrison continued, "that there are circumstances where strict adherence to the letter defeats the very purpose of the law itself. This is one of those circumstances." The smile on Finch's face faltered. "I have seen many cases in my years on this bench. I have seen children taken from loving homes and placed in institutions where they withered and died. I have seen children return to parents who beat them, starved them, abused them in ways I cannot speak of in this courtroom. I have seen the damage that can be done when the law is applied without wisdom, without compassion, without consideration for the human beings whose lives hang in the balance." He turned his gaze directly on Rowan and Elin. "What I have also seen today is something rare, something precious. I have seen a man who was lost find his way back through his love for a child. I have seen a child who was abandoned find a home with someone who values her beyond measure. I have seen family, not as defined by blood or paperwork, but as defined by choice, by sacrifice, by love." Morrison took a deep breath. "It is therefore my judgment that the petition of the Territorial Welfare Office is denied. Rowan Hale is hereby granted full legal custody of the minor child Elin with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. This matter is closed." For a moment, Rowan didn't understand. The words seemed to float past him without meaning, without weight. Then Elin threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time, and the reality of what had happened came crashing over him like a wave. They had won. They had won. The celebration that followed the judge's ruling lasted well into the evening, spilling out of the courthouse and into the streets of town like water bursting through a dam. People Rowan barely knew came up to shake his hand, to clap him on the shoulder, to tell him they had been rooting for him all along. Mrs. Patterson wept openly, pressing kisses to Elin's cheeks and calling her a brave little angel. Reverend Harker offered prayers of thanksgiving that, for once, didn't feel hollow or perfunctory. Even Sheriff Briggs cracked what might have been a smile, though it disappeared so quickly Rowan couldn't be sure he hadn't imagined it. Through it all, Rowan kept one hand firmly clasped around Elin's, afraid that if he let go, even for a moment, this fragile dream might shatter and he would wake to find himself back in the nightmare. But the dream held. The papers were signed, the seals were stamped, and by the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Rowan Hale was, in the eyes of the law and everyone who mattered, Elend's father. They rode home in the golden light of late afternoon, neither of them speaking, both of them still processing what had happened. The cabin came into view as the first stars were appearing in the sky, and Rowan felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying, a fear that had been his constant companion since the moment he first saw the sheriff riding toward his home. It was over. They were safe. Or so he thought. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks later, on a morning that had started like any other. Rowan was splitting wood behind the cabin, the rhythmic thunk of the axe providing a steady counterpoint to the birdsong that filled the air. Summer had arrived in earnest, and with it had come a warmth that seemed to seep into everything, the earth, the trees, the very air itself. The garden was thriving, producing more vegetables than he and Elend could possibly eat. The apple tree had grown another foot and sprouted dozens of new leaves. Life, it seemed, was finally settling into something like normalcy. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a voice spoke from behind him. "Rowan Hale?" He spun around, the axe still in his hands, and found himself facing a stranger, a man he had never seen before, dressed in the rough clothes of a frontier traveler but carrying himself with an authority that seemed out of place in this wilderness. "Who's asking?" "Name's Marcus Webb." The man held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I'm not looking for trouble, just information." "What kind of information?" "I'm looking for a child. A little girl, about 7 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes. I have reason to believe she might be living somewhere in this area." Rowan's grip tightened on the axe handle. "Why are you looking for her?" "That's a private matter." Webb's eyes were sharp, calculating. "But I can tell you this much. I've been hired by her family to find her and bring her home." The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. Family. After everything that had happened, after all they had been through, Elend's birth family was looking for her? "Her family abandoned her," Rowan said, his voice flat. "Left her in the forest to die. That's not family, that's murder." Something flickered in Webb's eyes, surprise, maybe, or calculation. "I don't know anything about that. I was just told to find her." "Who hired you?" "I'm not at liberty to say." "Then we have nothing to talk about." Rowan took a step forward, the axe still in his hands. "I don't know any child matching that description, and I don't appreciate strangers coming onto my property asking questions. I think you should leave." Webb studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged. "Fair enough. But Mr. Hale, if you do happen to come across this child, you should know. The people looking for her have resources, influence. They're not the kind of people who give up easily." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees with an ease that spoke of long experience in wild places. Rowan watched him go, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions and fears. Who had sent this man? Elend's birth parents? That seemed unlikely. They had wanted to be rid of her, had walked away and left her to die. Why would they suddenly want her back? Unless they didn't. Unless someone else was looking for her, someone with money and power and reasons Rowan couldn't begin to guess. He waited until Webb was long gone before setting down the axe and walking back to the cabin. Elend was inside, working on the sampler she had been embroidering for weeks, a simple design of flowers and vines that she was determined to get perfect. She looked up as he entered, her face bright with the innocent joy that had become her default expression since the court ruling. "Did you finish the wood?" "I thought I heard someone talking." Rowan hesitated. Every instinct told him to protect her from this, to shield her from the fear and uncertainty that Webb's visit had stirred up. But he had promised himself, after everything they had been through, that he would never lie to her about anything important. "There was a man here," he said carefully. "A stranger. He was looking for a little girl." Elend's face went pale. The sampler slipped from her fingers, falling forgotten to the floor. "Looking for me?" "He didn't say it was you specifically, but..." Rowan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Elin, I need you to tell me something. Before your parents left you in the forest, did anything else happen? Anything unusual? She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, her mind clearly traveling back to a place she had tried hard to forget. There were people who came to the farm, she said finally. A few weeks before they left me. Men in nice clothes, riding nice horses. They talked to my father for a long time, and after they left, he was different, scared almost, and angry. He and Mama fought about something, but they wouldn't tell me what. Do you know who the men were? She shook her head. I asked, but Papa just told me to mind my own business. And then, she swallowed hard. And then a few weeks later, they took me into the forest and walked away. Rowan's mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Who were these men? What had they wanted? And why, after all this time, was someone still looking for Elin? Listen to me, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Whatever is going on, whatever this man wants, I'm not going to let anyone take you away. You're my daughter now, legally and officially, and no one can change that. But what if they try? Then they'll have to go through me. The words were spoken with absolute conviction, and Elin seemed to draw strength from them. She nodded slowly, some of the fear leaving her eyes. Okay, she said. Okay. I trust you. Good. Rowan kissed her forehead and stood up. Now, I want you to stay inside for a while, just until I figure out what's going on. Can you do that? Yes. And if anyone comes to the door, anyone at all, you don't open it. You understand? I understand. He squeezed her shoulder and headed back outside, his mind already working on the problem. He needed information, and there was only one place in this territory where information could be had. He needed to go back to town. The ride to town felt longer than usual, every mile stretching out like an accusation. Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving Elin unprotected, that by seeking answers he was somehow putting her at greater risk. But he needed to know what he was dealing with. He needed to understand who was looking for his daughter and why. The town was busy when he arrived, filled with the usual bustle of frontier commerce, farmers selling produce, merchants hawking wares, children running through the streets with the careless abandon of youth. Rowan tied his horse outside the saloon and went inside, scanning the dim interior for familiar faces. He found what he was looking for at a table in the corner, a grizzled old man with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen everything worth seeing and plenty that wasn't. Silas, Rowan said, sliding into the chair across from him. Silas looked up from his whiskey, his expression unsurprised. Rowan Hale, I heard you won that court case. Congratulations. Thanks. I need information. Information costs money. Rowan dropped a small pouch of coins on the table. It was most of what he had saved over the past months, scraped together from trap lines and small trades, but he didn't hesitate. A man came to my cabin this morning, said his name was Marcus Webb, said he was looking for a child. Silas's eyes narrowed. Webb, you say? You know him? Know of him. He's a finder. Tracks down people who don't want to be found. Works for whoever pays him, and he's damn good at what he does. Who's paying him? Silas was quiet for a moment, his weathered fingers tracing the rim of his glass. That I don't know for certain, but I've heard rumors. What kind of rumors? The kind that involve money. Lots of money. Silas leaned forward, lowering his voice. Word is, there's a rich family back east looking for a child that was supposed to be theirs, that was taken from them or hidden from them or something. They've been searching for years, and they recently got a lead that brought them out this way. Rowan's blood ran cold. A rich family? What rich family? Dunno, but whoever they are, they've got enough money to hire someone like Webb, and enough connections to make things happen. If they're after your girl, Rowan, you've got trouble coming. She's not their girl, she's mine. I believe you, but believing and proving are two different things. Silas drained his whiskey and set the glass down with a decisive thunk. My advice? Find out what they want. Find out why they think this child belongs to them. Because if you don't get ahead of this thing, it's going to run you over. Rowan nodded slowly, his mind churning. Thanks, Silas. Don't thank me yet. You haven't heard the worst part. There's worse? Always is. Silas met his eyes, and for the first time, Rowan saw something like sympathy in the old man's weathered face. Webb's not the only one looking. I've heard there are others, lawyers, investigators, maybe even some folks who aren't so bound by the law. This family, whoever they are, they're throwing everything they have at finding this child, and they're not going to stop until they do. The ride home was faster than the ride to town, urgency lending speed to Rowan's horse. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears, possibilities and impossibilities. A rich family looking for a child, men in nice clothes visiting Elyn's parents before they abandoned her, a finder named Marcus Webb who wouldn't give up easily. What did it all mean? Who was Elyn really? And what did these people want with her? He burst through the cabin door to find Elyn exactly where he had left her, still sitting in her chair, her sampler abandoned on the floor. But she wasn't alone. Mrs. Chen was there. The ancient woman sat across from Elyn, a cup of tea in her wrinkled hands, her sharp eyes watching Rowan with an expression he couldn't read. Mrs. Chen. Rowan's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt. What are you doing here? Protecting your daughter. She set down her tea and rose to her feet with a grace that belied her years. There are people in this territory asking questions about a blonde child with blue eyes. I thought you should know that those questions have reached ears that should not hear them. Whose ears? Mr. Finch, for one. He may have lost the custody case, but he has not given up his crusade. He believes you stole this child from her rightful family, and he has been making inquiries. Rowan's jaw tightened. Finch has no authority over us anymore. The judge ruled. Rulings can be overturned. Evidence can be manufactured. Witnesses can be persuaded to change their stories. Mrs. Chen's voice was calm, matter of fact. You won a battle, Rowan Hale, but the war is not over. What do you suggest I do? Find out the truth. She moved toward the door, pausing to look back at him. This child has a past that someone is willing to spend a great deal of money to uncover. Until you know what that past is, you cannot protect her from it. She left without another word, disappearing into the trees with the same unsettling speed she had shown before. Rowan stood in the doorway, watching her go, feeling the weight of her words settling onto his shoulders. The truth. He needed to find the truth. But where did one even begin to look for something like that? The answer came from the most unexpected source. 3 days after Mrs. Chen's visit, a letter arrived at the cabin, delivered by a writer who refused to identify himself, who simply handed Rowan the envelope and rode away without a word. The letter was addressed to Mr. Rowan Hale, guardian of the child known as Elyn. The handwriting was elegant, formal, the kind of penmanship that spoke of expensive education and old money. Rowan opened it with trembling hands and read, Dear Mr. Hale, I am writing to you regarding a matter of the utmost importance and delicacy. It has come to my attention that a child matching the description of my granddaughter is currently residing in your care. I do not seek to cause distress or hardship to you or to the child. I seek only the truth. My son and his wife were involved in a terrible scandal some years ago, a scandal that resulted in their disgrace and exile from polite society. Before they left, they took with them my granddaughter, a child I loved more than life itself. I have been searching for her ever since. I am not a cruel woman, Mr. Hale. I have no desire to tear apart a family or cause suffering to an innocent child. But I must know, is the girl living with you my granddaughter? And if she is, what happened to her parents? Why did they abandon her in the wilderness? I will be traveling to Wyoming territory within the month to seek answers to these questions. I hope that we can meet as civilized people and discuss this matter rationally. I am prepared to offer a substantial sum of money for information, and I am willing to negotiate arrangements that would be beneficial to all parties involved. Please consider my request carefully. I await your response. Sincerely, Margaret Ashford, Boston, Massachusetts. Rowan read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to process its implications. A grandmother. Elyn had a grandmother, a wealthy grandmother who had been searching for her for years. A grandmother who believed Elyn had been taken from her, stolen by her own son and daughter-in-law. But why? What scandal had driven Elend's parents to flee? What had they done that was so terrible they had abandoned their own child rather than face it? And what would happen if this Margaret Ashford arrived and demanded her granddaughter back? Rowan looked across the cabin at Elend, who was playing with a small wooden horse he had carved for her. She was humming to herself, a song she had learned from Mrs. Patterson, and her face was peaceful and content in a way that it never had been during those first weeks after he found her. She was happy. She was safe. She was finally, after everything she had been through, beginning to heal. And now this. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. He would have to tell Elend, eventually. She had a right to know about her grandmother, about the family she had never known existed. But not yet. Not until he had figured out what to do. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of Rowan's life. He began making inquiries of his own, using the network of contacts he had built during his days as a more sociable member of the community. He wrote letters to people who might know something about the Ashford family, about scandals in Boston high society, about children who had gone missing years ago. The responses that came back painted a picture that was both clearer and more confusing than he had expected. The Ashfords, it seemed, were one of the wealthiest families in Boston. Old money, old connections, old power. They had made their fortune in shipping and banking, and they had used that fortune to build an empire that stretched across half the eastern seaboard. But all empires have their secrets, and the Ashfords were no exception. According to the letters Rowan received, the scandal that had driven Elend's parents into exile had involved theft, not of money, but of something far more valuable. Elend's father, it seemed, had discovered evidence that his own parents had built their fortune on fraud and deception, on deals that had ruined countless families and destroyed countless lives. Rather than keep silent, he had threatened to expose them, and so they had destroyed him first. Using their money and influence, the Ashfords had manufactured evidence that their son was a thief and a liar. They had turned his friends against him, closed every door that might have offered him refuge, made it impossible for him to find work or support his family. And when he had fled west to escape their reach, they had sent people after him, not to bring him back, but to make sure he could never return. Elend's parents hadn't abandoned her because they didn't want her. They had abandoned her because they were trying to protect her, trying to hide her from the grandparents who saw her as nothing more than a pawn in their game of power and control. And they had died for it. Rowan learned, through careful inquiry, that Elend's parents had been found dead in a cabin 50 miles from where he had discovered Elend in the snow. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but there were whispers of something darker, of signs of violence, of a struggle, of evidence that someone had wanted to make sure they never spoke again. The Ashfords had killed their own son to keep their secrets safe, and now they wanted Elend, not out of love, but out of a desire to control the last piece of evidence that could destroy them. Rowan couldn't let that happen. He sat Elend down that evening after dinner and told her everything he had learned. He didn't soften the truth or hide the ugliness of it. She had earned the right to know, and he owed her honesty. She listened in silence, her face pale, her eyes wide. When he finished, she didn't cry. She had learned in her short, hard life to hold her tears inside. But her hands were shaking, and her voice, when she spoke, was barely more than a whisper. My parents didn't leave me because they didn't want me? No. Rowan took her hands in his. They left you because they loved you, because they wanted to protect you from people who would use you and hurt you and never care about who you really are. But they died. Yes, they died trying to keep you safe. She was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information, trying to fit it into the narrative she had built around her own abandonment. And now my grandmother wants me back? She says she does, but I don't think she wants you for the right reasons. What do you mean? Rowan hesitated, trying to find words that would explain the cruelty of adults without destroying whatever innocence Elend had left. Your grandmother is a powerful woman, he said finally, and powerful people sometimes do terrible things to protect their power. I think she wants you because you know things she doesn't want other people to know, or because she's afraid you might learn things someday that could hurt her. So she doesn't really love me. I don't know if she does or not, but I know this. She's not coming here because she cares about what's best for you. She's coming here because she cares about what's best for herself. Ellen's jaw set in that stubborn line that Rowan had come to know so well. I'm not going with her. No, you're not. She can't make me. She's going to try, but I won't let her succeed. Elin looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her summer sky eyes he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not just trust, not just love, but a fierce, unwavering faith that he would keep his word no matter what. You promise? Promise. Cross your heart. He made the gesture solemnly. Cross my heart. She nodded, satisfied, and reached out to take his hand. Then we'll fight her together. Margaret Ashford arrived in Wyoming Territory on a morning in late August, with a retinue of servants, lawyers, and hired men that seemed more suited to a military campaign than a family visit. Word of her arrival spread through the territory like wildfire. A wealthy woman from Boston, come to claim a child that a local man had been raising as his own. The gossips had a field day, spinning wild theories about kidnapping and hidden fortunes and star-crossed lovers. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complicated than anything they imagined. Rowan heard about her arrival from Sheriff Briggs, who rode out to the cabin personally to deliver the news. She's staying at the hotel in town, the sheriff said, his face grim. Got a whole floor to herself, from what I hear, and she's already been to see Judge Morrison. What does she want from the judge? Same thing she wants from everyone, the child. She's claiming you abducted her granddaughter, that you've been holding her against her will. She's got lawyers drawing up papers as we speak. Rowan felt his blood run cold. The judge already ruled on this. He gave me legal custody. I know, but Mrs. Ashford is persuasive, and she's got resources that you don't. Briggs paused, his eyes meeting Rowan's with something like regret. I'm not saying she's going to win. I'm just saying you need to be prepared for a fight. I'm always prepared for a fight. The sheriff nodded slowly. I believe you are. And for what it's worth, I hope you win. That girl deserves better than to be a pawn in some rich woman's game. He rode away, leaving Rowan standing in the yard with his hands clenched into fists and his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. So this was it, the confrontation he had been dreading, the battle he had been preparing for. Margaret Ashford had come to take Elin away, and she had brought the full weight of her wealth and power to bear. But Rowan had something she didn't, something that no amount of money could buy. He had the truth, and he had the love of a child who had chosen him, just as he had chosen her. He went inside to find Elin already dressed in her best clothes, her hair brushed and braided, her face pale but determined. I heard, she said before he could speak. She's here. Yes. Are we going to town? Rowan studied her, this small, fierce, unbreakable child who had survived abandonment and near death and sickness and uncertainty, who had stood before a judge and declared that she would never leave the man who had saved her. Are you sure you're ready for this? No. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. But I'm going anyway, because this is my life, and I'm not going to let some stranger decide it for me. Pride swelled in Rowan's chest, pride and love and a fierce protective instinct that felt almost physical. That's my girl, he said. Let's go show them what we're made of. The ride to town felt different this time, not desperate like before, but deliberate, purposeful. They were riding into battle, both of them knew it, and they were as ready as they would ever be. The town square was packed when they arrived. Word had spread about the confrontation, and it seemed like half the territory had come to witness it. Rowan recognized faces in the crowd, supporters and skeptics, friends and strangers, people who had testified on his behalf, and people who had questioned his fitness as a father. And there, in the center of it all, stood Margaret Ashford. She was exactly what Rowan had expected. Elegant and imperious, with silver hair swept up in an elaborate style and eyes that gleamed with cold intelligence. She was surrounded by lawyers and servants, a queen holding court in a foreign land, and when she saw Rowan and Elin approaching, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Hale, she said, her voice carrying across the square, how good of you to come, and this must be… Her gaze shifted to Elin, and something flickered in her eyes. Hunger, maybe, or calculation. This must be my granddaughter. Elin's hand tightened in Rowan's grip, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I'm not your granddaughter. I'm Elin Hale. and you can't have me." A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret Ashford's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "My dear child, I understand this must be confusing for you. You've been through so much, and this man has filled your head with lies. But I'm your family, your real family. I've come to take you home." "This is my home." Ellen's voice rose, clear and strong. "And Rowan is my real family. He found me. He saved me. He never left me alone in the forest to die like my parents did." Margaret's face went pale. "Your parents loved you. They were trying to protect you." "From who? From you?" Ellen took a step forward, and there was a fire in her eyes that made her seem much older than her 7 years. "I know what you did to them. I know you destroyed their lives because they wouldn't keep your secrets. And I know you're only here because you're afraid of what I might know." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Margaret Ashford's composure cracked, just for a moment, revealing something ugly beneath the elegant surface. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "You're just a child. You couldn't possibly understand." "I understand enough." Ellen's voice was steady. "I understand that you killed my parents. I understand that you've been lying to everyone for years. And I understand that I will never, ever go with you. Not today. Not ever." Margaret turned to the lawyers flanking her. "This is ridiculous. The child has been manipulated, brainwashed by this common laborer. I demand that she be placed in my custody immediately." But before the lawyers could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Mrs. Ashford, I think you'll find that's not going to happen." Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the crowd was a man Rowan had never seen before, a tall man with sharp features and sharper eyes, dressed in the understated clothes of someone who had money but didn't need to flaunt it. "Who are you?" Margaret demanded. "My name is Thomas Mercer. I'm an investigator, hired by parties who have a vested interest in seeing justice done." He stepped forward, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I've been looking into your family's affairs for quite some time, Mrs. Ashford. And I have to say the things I've found are illuminating." Margaret's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Mercer smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Fraud, embezzlement, bribery of public officials, and that's just the beginning." He held up the papers. "I have sworn statements from half a dozen former employees of your company documenting systematic theft from investors and clients. I have bank records showing payments to judges and politicians. And I have testimony from witnesses who saw what really happened to your son and his wife." The crowd erupted in whispers. Margaret Ashford swayed on her feet, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. This is slander. I'll have you arrested. You'll do nothing." Mercer's voice was cold. "Because if you do anything at all, these documents go to every newspaper on the eastern seaboard, and then everyone will know what kind of woman you really are." For a long moment, Margaret Ashford stood frozen, her eyes darting between Mercer and Ellen and Rowan, searching for a way out that didn't exist. Then, slowly, her shoulders sagged, and the fight seemed to drain out of her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I want you to leave, today. I want you to go back to Boston and never contact this child again. And I want you to live the rest of your life knowing that your crimes have not been forgotten, and that if you ever try anything like this again, you will face the consequences." Margaret's lips trembled. For just a moment, she looked old and tired and defeated, stripped of all the power and prestige that had defined her life. "The child is mine," she whispered. "By blood, by right." "Blood doesn't make a family," Rowan said, stepping forward. "Love does. Sacrifice does. Being there when it matters does. You abandoned your own son, drove him to his death, and now you want to claim his daughter as your property? That's not love. That's ownership. And Ellen is not something to be owned." Margaret's eyes met his, and in them he saw something he hadn't expected. Not hatred, not fury, but something that looked almost like regret. "I loved my son," she said quietly. "In my way." "Your way wasn't good enough." She flinched as if he had struck her. Then without another word, she turned and walked away, her servants and lawyers hurrying after her, the crowd parting before her like water before a ship. In minutes, she was gone. The silence that followed her departure was broken by a sound that Rowan hadn't heard in a long time, the sound of applause. It started small, just a few people clapping, but it spread quickly until the whole square was filled with cheering and shouting and expressions of joy. Rowan stood in the center of it all, Elend's hand in his, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over him like a warm blanket. It was over. Truly over this time. Margaret Ashford was gone, her threats neutralized, her power broken. And Elend, his Elend, was safe. He looked down at her and found her looking up at him, her summer sky eyes bright with tears that she was finally allowing herself to shed. "We did it," she whispered. "We did it," he agreed. "She's really gone?" "She's really gone, and she's not coming back." Elend threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest, and Rowan held her tight, feeling her small body shake with sobs of relief. Around them, the crowd continued to celebrate, but Rowan barely noticed. His whole world had narrowed to this moment, this child, this overwhelming sense of gratitude and love. They had stood against the world, and the world had blinked first. The ride home that evening was different from any that had come before. The tension that had been their constant companion for months had finally dissipated, leaving behind a lightness that felt almost foreign. Elend fell asleep against Rowan's chest before they were halfway home, exhausted by the emotional ordeal of the day. He held her carefully, guiding the horse with one hand, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. She had been so brave, braver than anyone had a right to expect from a 7-year-old child. She had faced down the woman who had destroyed her birth family, who had tried to claim her as property, and she had stood firm. His daughter. His fierce, unbreakable, extraordinary daughter. When they reached the cabin, Rowan carried her inside and laid her gently on her bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin the way Sarah used to do for him. She stirred as he turned to go, her hand catching his sleeve. "Rowan? I'm here. Is it really over?" He smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle. "It's really over. No more people coming to take me away?" "No more. You're home, Elend, for good." She smiled, a real smile, free of the shadows that had haunted her for so long, and closed her eyes. "Good," she murmured, "because I'm never leaving." Rowan sat beside her bed long after she had fallen asleep, watching her breathe, counting his blessings one by one. He had a daughter, he had a home, he had a future, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had hope. Outside, the night was clear and cold, filled with stars that seemed to shine just a little brighter than before. The apple tree in the garden rustled in the breeze, its leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of rebuilding, of planting new seeds and tending new growth, of creating a life together that was truly their own. But tonight, there was only peace. Tonight, there was only home. The seasons turned, as they always do, indifferent to the dramas of human hearts. Autumn arrived with a blaze of color that set the mountains on fire, reds and oranges and golds that seemed too vivid to be real, and then faded into the quiet gray of early winter. Snow fell, blanketing the world in white, and the cabin that had once been a monument to grief became something else entirely, a home filled with warmth and laughter and the unmistakable presence of love. A year had passed since that day in the town square, when Margaret Ashford had been forced to retreat, her power broken, her threats neutralized. In that time, Rowan and Elend had settled into a rhythm of life that felt as natural as breathing. They worked the land together, tending the garden in summer and checking the trap lines in winter. They read books by firelight on long, dark evenings, Elend's reading improving week by week until she could tackle chapters on her own. They talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of easy companionship that comes from shared trials and mutual trust. And the apple tree grew. What had started as a single bruised fruit planted in hope had become a young tree, its trunk sturdy, its branches reaching toward the sky with the same stubborn determination that had kept Elend alive through that terrible winter night. It had survived its first frost, its first summer drought, its first assault by hungry deer who had been deterred only by the fence Rowan built around it. Now, as the second winter of their time together approached, it stood bare but strong, waiting for spring to bring it back to life. Elin visited it every day, no matter the weather. She would stand before it, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching, as if the tree held secrets that only she could hear. Rowan never asked her what she said during those moments. Some things were private, even between a father and daughter. It was during one of these visits, on a morning in late November when the first true snowfall of the season was dusting the ground, that Elin asked the question Rowan had been waiting for. "Do you think they would have liked me?" He was chopping wood nearby, the rhythmic thunk of the axe providing a steady counterpoint to her words. He paused, the axe suspended in mid-swing, and turned to look at her. "Who?" "My real parents." She was staring at the tree, her back to him, her voice carefully neutral. "The ones who died. Do you think they would have liked who I've become?" Rowan set down the axe and walked over to stand beside her. The tree's bare branches cast skeletal shadows on the snow, and Elin's breath formed small white clouds in the cold air. "I think they would have been proud of you," he said carefully. "From what we learned about them, they loved you very much. They sacrificed everything to keep you safe. But they left me alone in the forest. They walked away and didn't come back. Because they were trying to protect you from something worse. From people who would have used you, hurt you, turned you into a weapon in their war." He put his hand on her shoulder. "They made an impossible choice, Elin, and it cost them their lives, but everything they did for you." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the tree. "I used to hate them," she said finally. "After you found me, after I started to feel safe, I would lie awake at night and hate them for leaving me. I thought they were monsters. I thought they must have been the cruelest people in the world to abandon their own child. And now? Now I just feel sad." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Sad for them, sad for what they went through, sad that I'll never get to know them. They're not monsters, they were just people. People who loved me and made terrible mistakes and paid for them with their lives." Rowan pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "That's called growing up," he said softly. "Learning that the world isn't divided into heroes and villains. Learning that people can love you and hurt you at the same time. It's a hard lesson, but it's an important one." "Is that what happened with you and Sarah?" The question caught him off guard. They rarely talked about Sarah anymore. Not because Rowan had forgotten her, but because her memory had become something private, something he kept in a quiet corner of his heart rather than wearing on his sleeve. "What do you mean?" "You loved her. And losing her hurt you, but that doesn't make her a villain, does it? She didn't choose to die." "No, she didn't." "So sometimes love and pain just go together?" "Sometimes." He pulled back to look at her, this remarkable child who had somehow become the center of his world. "But sometimes love is also what heals the pain. Sometimes loving someone new doesn't replace what you lost. It just gives you a new reason to keep going." Elin considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Is that what I am? A new reason to keep going?" "You're more than that." Rowan's voice was thick with emotion. "You're my daughter, my family, my future. You're the best thing that ever happened to me since Sarah, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that I found you in that snow." She smiled then, a real smile, bright and warm and free of shadows. "I'm grateful too," she said. "Grateful that you found me. Grateful that you kept me. Grateful that you fought for me when everyone else would have given up. I'll always fight for you, Elin. Always." She hugged him then, her small arms wrapping around his waist with surprising strength. "I know," she whispered. "That's what makes you my father." They stood there together in the falling snow, the apple tree watching over them like a silent guardian, until the cold finally drove them back inside to the warmth of the fire. Winter settled in with its usual ferocity, burying the world in white and cutting them off from civilization for weeks at a time. But unlike the winters that had come before, the winter when Rowan had nearly lost himself to grief, the winter when Elin had nearly frozen to death, this winter felt different. It felt like a pause rather than a prison, a time to rest and reflect rather than to struggle and survive. They had enough food stored to last until spring, vegetables from the garden, meat from the trap lines, flour and salt and coffee traded for furs in the fall. They had enough wood to keep the fire burning around the clock. They had books to read, games to play, stories to tell. And most importantly, they had each other. The long evenings by the fire became Rowan's favorite part of the day. Sometimes they would read together, taking turns with whatever book they had on hand. Sometimes Elin would work on her embroidery while Rowan carved small figures out of wood, animals mostly, but sometimes people, sometimes scenes from their life together. And sometimes they would just talk, their conversations ranging from the trivial to the profound, with the easy flow of two people who had long since stopped needing to fill silence with noise. It was during one of these evenings, in the depths of January, when the cold was so fierce that ice formed on the inside of the windows, that Elin asked another question that Rowan had been waiting for. What happened to Mrs. Ashford? He looked up from the horse he was carving, surprised. They hadn't spoken about Margaret Ashford since the confrontation in the town square, and he had hoped, that Elin had put the whole thing behind her. What made you think of her? I don't know. Elin was staring into the fire, her expression thoughtful. I was just wondering. She came all this way, spent all that money, tried so hard to take me back, and then she just disappeared. I want to know what happened to her. Rowan set down his carving and considered how to answer. The truth was, he had been keeping track of Margaret Ashford quietly through the network of contacts he had built during the custody battle. He knew more than he had told Elin, and he wasn't sure how much she was ready to hear. She went back to Boston, he said finally. After what happened here, after Thomas Mercer threatened to release those documents, she didn't have much choice. Her lawyers negotiated a deal. She would leave you alone, and in return, Mercer would keep the evidence out of the newspapers. So she got away with it? With everything she did? Not exactly. Rowan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The thing about secrets is, they have a way of coming out eventually. Even if the newspapers didn't publish Mercer's documents, people talked. Rumors spread. Within a few months, the Ashford family's reputation was in ruins. Their business partners pulled out. Their society friends stopped inviting them to parties. Margaret Ashford went from being one of the most powerful women in Boston to being a pariah. Good. The word was sharp, fierce, and Rowan felt a flash of pride at the steel in his daughter's voice. There's more. He hesitated, unsure how she would take this next part. About 6 months ago, Margaret Ashford died. Elin's head snapped up. Died? Her heart, from what I heard. She was alone when it happened. No family, no friends, no one to mourn her. Just an old woman who had sacrificed everything for power and ended up with nothing. Elin was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Rowan watched her face, trying to read her expression, but she had gotten better at hiding her emotions over the past year. A survival skill she had learned from him, he suspected. I don't know how to feel about that, she said finally. Part of me is glad she's dead. Part of me feels like she deserved worse after what she did to my parents. But another part of me just feels empty. Like it doesn't matter anymore, like she can't hurt anyone else, and that's enough. That's a very mature way to look at it. Is it? She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with something he couldn't quite name. Sometimes I feel like I'm too young to have thoughts like this. Like I should be playing with dolls and making up stories instead of thinking about death and revenge and justice. Rowan's heart ached for her, for the childhood she had lost, for the burdens she had been forced to carry, for the way life had shaped her into something harder and sharper than any 8-year-old should be. You've been through more than most people experience in a lifetime, he said gently. It's not surprising that you think about things differently than other children. But that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means you've had to grow up faster than you should have. Do you think I'll ever get to be normal, like other kids? I think normal is overrated. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. And I think you're exactly who you're supposed to be. Smart, brave, kind, strong. That's worth more than normal any day. She smiled at that, a small smile but genuine. Thank you, Rowan. For what? For always knowing the right thing to say. I don't always know the right thing to say. Most of the time, I'm just making it up as I go along. Well, you're good at it. He laughed then, and she laughed with him, and the weight of their conversation lifted like fog burning off in the morning sun. Spring arrived early that year, as if the world itself was tired of waiting. The snow melted faster than Rowan had ever seen it melt, sending rivers of runoff cascading down the mountainsides and turning every creek and stream into a churning torrent. The days grew longer and warmer, and the world that had seemed dead beneath its blanket of white came roaring back to life. The apple tree was the first to wake. Rowan noticed the buds one morning in late March, tiny green nubs emerging from the bare branches like promises of things to come. He called Elin over to see, and they stood together in the pale morning light, watching as their tree prepared to bloom. "It's really going to happen," Elin breathed. "It's really going to grow apples." "Looks like it." "I never thought it would. When we first planted it, I thought it was just, I don't know, a symbol or something, a way to let go of the past. I never really believed it would become a real tree with real fruit." "That's the thing about hope," Rowan said. "Sometimes it surprises you." The weeks that followed were filled with the work of spring, planting the garden, repairing the winter damage to the cabin, preparing the trap lines for the lean months ahead. But no matter how busy they were, they always found time to check on the apple tree, watching as the buds swelled and opened into delicate white blossoms that filled the air with their sweet perfume. "They're beautiful," Elin said one evening, standing beneath the canopy of flowers as the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold. "I never knew apple blossoms could be so beautiful." "Your mother gave you that apple," Rowan said quietly. "It was the last thing she gave you before everything happened. And now look what it's become. Something beautiful, something alive, something that will keep on growing long after we're both gone." Elin reached up to touch one of the blossoms, her fingers gentle on the delicate petals. "Do you think she knows?" she asked. "My mother, I mean, wherever she is. Do you think she can see what happened to her apple?" "I don't know." Rowan put his arm around her shoulders. "But I like to think she does. I like to think she's watching over you, proud of who you've become, grateful that you found your way to safety." "I like to think that too." They stood there together as the sun sank below the mountains, watching their apple tree bloom in the fading light. The summer that followed was the best of Rowan's life. It wasn't that anything extraordinary happened, no dramatic confrontations, no life-threatening crises, no villains to defeat or battles to win. It was extraordinary precisely because it was ordinary. Days filled with work and play, with laughter and conversation, with the simple pleasures of a life well lived. Elin turned 9 in July, and Rowan threw her the first real birthday party she had ever had. It wasn't much by city standards, just Mrs. Patterson and the Hendricks family and Reverend Harker gathered around a cake that Rowan had somehow managed to bake without burning down the cabin. But Elin acted like it was the grandest celebration in the history of the world. She blew out her candles, opened her presents, and played games with the Hendricks children until well past dark. That night, after the guests had gone home and the cabin was quiet again, she came to Rowan with something in her hands. "I want to show you something," she said. "I've been working on it for a while." She handed him the sampler she had been embroidering for months, the same one she had been working on when he first told her about the stranger asking questions, the same one that had been pushed aside during the chaos that followed. It was finished now, the design complete, the stitches neat and even. It showed 2 figures standing hand in hand beneath an apple tree, the tree's branches heavy with fruit. Above them, stitched in careful letters, were the words, "Home is where we choose to be." Rowan's vision blurred with tears he didn't try to hide. "Elin, do you like it? I know it's not very good. I'm still learning, but I wanted to make something for you. Something to remember this day. The day I turned 9 in my real home with my real father." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, the sampler pressed between them. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "It's absolutely perfect." "Really?" "Really." He pulled back to look at her, this remarkable child who had transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. "Thank you, Elin. This is the best gift anyone has ever given me." She beamed at him, her face glowing with happiness. "Happy birthday to me," she said. "And happy everything to you." He laughed through his tears and hugged her again, and in that moment, he knew that all the pain and struggle and fear had been worth it. Every moment of darkness had led to this: a child who loved him, a home that was truly his, a future that stretched out before them like an endless road. He hung the sampler above the fireplace that very night, where it would remain for years to come, a reminder of what they had built together and what they had overcome. Autumn brought changes of a different kind. The apple tree, which had bloomed so beautifully in spring, had produced its first fruit, a handful of small red apples that hung from its branches like jewels. They weren't many, and they weren't perfect, but they were real. Real apples, grown from a single bruised fruit that a frightened little girl had clutched in her frozen hands as she waited to die. Rowan and Elin harvested them together on a cool October morning, handling each one with reverent care. "What should we do with them?" Elin asked, cradling an apple in her palms. "Whatever you want. They're your apples." She thought about it for a moment. "I want to make a pie, like the kind Sarah used to make." Rowan's breath caught in his throat. She had never mentioned Sarah before. Not like this, not as someone whose traditions she wanted to carry on. "You remember the pies? You told me about them. Back when I was sick, when you were trying to keep me awake. You told me about Sarah's apple pies, how she made them every autumn from the wild apples in the meadow." She looked up at him, her eyes earnest. "I thought maybe we could make one together, to honor her, and to celebrate us." Rowan had to swallow hard before he could speak. "I think that's a wonderful idea." They spent the rest of the day making the pie, or rather, attempting to make it, since neither of them really knew what they were doing. Rowan had watched Sarah make pies dozens of times, but watching and doing were two very different things. The crust came out lumpy and uneven. The filling was too sweet in some places and not sweet enough in others. The whole thing looked more like a science experiment than a dessert. But when they finally pulled it from the oven and cut into it, when the smell of warm apples and cinnamon filled the cabin and Elin took her first bite and pronounced it the best pie in the whole world, none of that mattered. "To Sarah," Rowan said, raising a forkful of pie and a toast, "who taught me that love is worth fighting for." "To Sarah," Elin echoed, "and to you, who showed me that family is a choice." They ate the whole pie that night, just the two of them, talking and laughing and remembering. And when it was gone, when the dish sat empty on the table and the fire had burned down to embers, Elin looked at Rowan with an expression he had never seen before. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I want to be when I grow up." "And what's that?" "A mother." She said it simply, matter-of-factly. "I want to have children of my own someday. And I want to raise them the way you raised me, with love and patience and the knowledge that they're wanted, that they matter, that they'll never be abandoned." Rowan felt tears prick his eyes again. He seemed to cry a lot these days, something the old him would have been ashamed of, but the new him had learned to accept. "You'll be a wonderful mother," he said. "The best." "You think so?" "I know so. Because you know what it feels like to be unloved, and you'll never let your children feel that way. You know what it feels like to be saved, and you'll pass that gift on to everyone you meet." She smiled, that bright, unguarded smile that still had the power to light up his whole world. "Thank you for believing in me. Always, Elin, always." The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect. No life is perfect, but good. Full of the small joys and petty struggles that make up a human existence. Full of growth and change and the gradual unfolding of two lives intertwined. Elin grew from a child into a young woman, her beauty deepening along with her wisdom. She attended the small schoolhouse in town when the weather permitted, making friends and earning admirers with equal ease. She read voraciously, devouring every book she could get her hands on, and she wrote stories of her own, tales of adventure and romance, and always redemption. Rowan grew too, though in different ways. The grief that had defined him for so long faded into something softer, something that no longer hurt to touch. He rejoined the community he had abandoned, forming friendships with neighbors he had once shunned. He even learned to laugh again, really laugh, the kind that came from deep in his belly and left him gasping for breath. And the apple tree grew tallest of all. Each year it produced more fruit than the last, and each autumn Rowan and Elin would harvest the apples together, making pies and preserves and gifts for the neighbors who had become like family. The tree that had started as a symbol of hope had become something more, a living testament to what love could build, what perseverance could achieve, what two broken people could become when they chose to heal together. It was beneath this tree, on an evening in late September when Elin was 17 years old, that the final chapter of their story began. They were sitting together on the bench Rowan had built years ago, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of ripe apples and wood smoke and the first hints of autumn decay. "There's something I need to tell you," Elin said, her voice uncharacteristically nervous. Rowan looked at her, this young woman who had once been a frozen child in his arms, and felt his heart clench with a familiar mixture of love and fear. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position in Denver, teaching at a school for girls who have been through difficult circumstances, girls who need someone who understands what they've experienced." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's a good opportunity, a chance to help others the way you helped me." Rowan felt the breath leave his lungs. He had known this day would come, had prepared for it in his way, telling himself that his job as a father was to raise Elin to be independent, to give her roots and wings and trust her to use both. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your heart were two very different things. "Denver," he said finally. "That's a long way from here." "I know." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And I don't want to leave you. You're my father, my real father, the one who chose me. The thought of being separated from you makes me feel like I can't breathe. But this is something I need to do. Those girls, they're like I was, lost and scared and convinced that no one wants them. And I know in my bones that I can help them. That everything I went through, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, it all led to this moment, this chance to turn my suffering into something meaningful." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, looking at the tree that had grown from nothing, at the cabin that had transformed from a tomb to a home, at the young woman who had saved him every bit as much as he had saved her. "You're right," he said finally. "This is something you need to do. You're not angry?" "Angry?" He laughed softly. "Elin, I could never be angry at you for wanting to help others. That's what I've raised you to do. That's what all of this," he gestured at the tree, the cabin, the life they had built, "has been about. Learning to turn pain into purpose. Learning to take what breaks you and use it to build something stronger." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to leave you alone. I won't be alone." He took her hands in his. "I'll have this cabin, these mountains, these memories. I'll have the friends we've made, the community we've built. And most importantly, I'll have the knowledge that somewhere out there, my daughter is changing lives the way she changed mine. You'll write to me? Every week? Every day? If you want? And you'll visit? As often as I can." She threw her arms around him, holding him tight, and Rowan held her back, memorizing the feel of her, the smell of her, the sound of her heartbeat against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything, for finding me, for keeping me, for making me who I am." "You made yourself who you are," he said. "I just gave you a safe place to do it." They stayed there beneath the apple tree until the stars came out, talking about the future, remembering the past, savoring these final moments before everything changed. And when Elin finally pulled away, when she stood up and took a deep breath and squared her shoulders with that familiar determination, Rowan saw in her eyes the same strength that had kept her alive through that terrible winter night, the same courage that had allowed her to stand before a judge and claim him as her father, the same unbreakable spirit that had defied Margaret Ashford and everyone else who had tried to tear them apart. "I love you, Papa," she said, the first time she had ever called him that. Rowan felt his heart crack open and rebuild itself in the space of a single breath. "I love you too, daughter, more than words can say." She left 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning with the apple tree blazing red and gold behind her. Rowan stood in the yard and watched her ride away, his hand raised in farewell, his heart full of pride and loss and hope. She turned back once just before she disappeared around the bend in the trail. She waved, that familiar bright smile on her face, and Rowan waved back. And then she was gone. He stood there for a long time after, looking at the empty trail, feeling the weight of her absence settle onto his shoulders. The cabin behind him was quiet, quieter than it had been in years, and the silence felt both peaceful and profound. But it wasn't a sad silence. Not anymore. Because the silence was full of memories, of a frozen child in his arms, of a fever that almost stole her away, of a courtroom where love had triumphed over law, of pies and stories and laughter and tears, of two broken people who had chosen each other, saved each other, become a family in every way that mattered. Rowan walked to the apple tree and placed his hand on its trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath his palm, feeling the life that pulsed through it like a heartbeat. "We did it, Sarah," he said softly. "We raised a daughter, and she's going to change the world." The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of apples and the promise of things to come. Rowan smiled, turned, and walked back to his cabin, the cabin that had been a prison, then a shelter, then a home. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. In the garden, the last of the autumn vegetables waited to be harvested. In the barn, the horse stamped and whinnied, ready for its evening feed. And in the distance, somewhere along that winding trail, Elin was riding toward her future, a future she had earned through courage and love and an unshakable refusal to give up. It was, Rowan thought, a good ending, or rather, a good beginning. Because the story of a family forged by choice, of love that defied blood and law and circumstance, of two people who had found each other in the darkest of nights and held on through the storm, that story would continue. In the lives Elin would touch, the children she would help, the legacy of compassion and resilience she would pass on. The girl who had been left in the snow to die had become a woman who would teach others to live, and the man who had found her, who had chosen her, who had fought for her against all odds, he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not just a daughter, not just a family, but a purpose, a reason, a life worth living. Rowan closed the cabin door behind him and lit the evening fire. Outside, the apple tree stood sentinel against the darkening sky, its branches reaching toward the stars like arms raised in gratitude. Tomorrow, he would write his first letter to Elin. Tomorrow, he would begin the next chapter of his life. But tonight, there was only this: the crackle of the fire, the warmth of memories, and the deep, abiding peace of a story well told. A story of loss and redemption, a story of darkness and light, a story of a family forged by choice, bound not by blood, but by something stronger, something that no winter could freeze, no law could break, no force on earth could destroy. Love. Simple as that. Love.